Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Phantom Airport in Arizona. Have you ever felt like a single email could change your life? That thought looped in my mind as I stared at the screen. The message had no sender name, just an obscure subject line: unlock the secrets of Arizona's forgotten airport. I had spent years chasing the strange and the unexplained for my travel blog. Abandoned hotels, ghost towns, eerie roadside attractions, each had its quirks, but none promised the thrill hinted at in this message. The email's text was short, almost cryptic. In the Arizona desert lies an airport long forgotten by time. No records, no visitors, but endless whispers of what's been left behind. Follow the coordinates. Bring your camera. The world deserves to know. There was something off about it. No sender, no further details. Yet, I couldn't shake the pull. I'd recently hit a rut in my blog's content, and this could be the shot of adrenaline my work needed. Was it a prank? Maybe. But if it wasn't, it could be the story of a lifetime. I grabbed my gear, a DSLR camera, voice recorder, flashlight, and my trusty notebook. For good measure, I packed extra batteries, bottled water, and a small knife. The desert was no place to take chances, and I didn't know what or who might be waiting out there. As I loaded my car, the setting sun painted the horizon with streaks of crimson and gold, casting long shadows across my driveway. The air buzzed with anticipation. This felt like the beginning of something big, but I couldn't tell if that was excitement or unease prickling my skin. The GPS guided me toward the heart of Arizona's desolate landscape. An hour out, the cell signal vanished, leaving only the hum of my tires and the endless stretch of desert ahead. The road became narrower, the asphalt cracked and worn, until it finally turned to dirt. By the time I reached the coordinates, twilight had given way to darkness. The airport loomed ahead, a cluster of weathered buildings, skeletal hangars, and a runway that seemed to stretch forever into the void. A chill ran down my spine, despite the desert heat. There was something unnatural about this place. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive, as though the very air was watching. I parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounding unnervingly loud. This was it, the forgotten airport. A place lost to time, full of secrets that begged to be uncovered. And I had no idea what I was about to find. The headlights of my car barely illuminated the crumbling sign that read, Desert Skies Airport, established 1947. The paint was so faded it was almost invisible, and the edges of the sign were eaten away by rust. Behind it, the sprawling outline of the airport came into focus. To the left, a dilapidated control tower stood tall, its windows shattered and dark, like empty eyes watching my every move. The hangars were massive, their metal walls warped and peeling. A few wind-torn banners still clung stubbornly to the framework of an old terminal entrance. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car. The silence was immediate and suffocating. The wind whispered faintly, carrying the scent of dust and decay. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached the terminal. The building had clearly once been grand, a mid-century marvel designed for a hopeful future. Now it was just a skeleton of its former self. Broken glass crunched underfoot as I walked toward the entrance, where a faded departure sign hung crookedly above the door. The air felt unnaturally cold for the desert. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the stillness, the eerie sense that the airport itself was holding its breath. Inside, the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the last rays of sunlight filtering through the broken windows. My flashlight's beam flickered across rows of dust-covered chairs in the waiting area. Old posters on the walls advertised destinations long forgotten: Fly to the Future, Desert Skies Airlines. A water fountain stood in the corner, its spout corroded and dry. Nearby, a vending machine was tipped on its side, its glass shattered and contents long gone. The echoes of my footsteps bounced off the empty walls, giving the impression that someone, or something, was walking just a few paces behind me. I reached what appeared to be the check-in counter. Papers littered the surface, yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. One caught my eye, a boarding pass for a flight to Denver, dated June 12, 1973. Beneath it, a suitcase lay abandoned, its handle coated in a layer of dust thick enough to write in. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then, I swore I caught movement in my peripheral vision, shadows shifting where there should have been none. My rational mind tried to dismiss it as the tricks of a failing flashlight and my own anxiety. But the further I ventured into the terminal, the more the air seemed to hum with something unexplainable. It was as though the walls themselves held memories, echoes of laughter, announcements, and footsteps that had long since faded. And somewhere, faintly, I thought I heard the sound of an engine starting. The deeper I moved into the terminal, the heavier the air seemed to grow, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. My flashlight beam jittered as my hand trembled slightly, the cone of light dancing across peeling wallpaper and forgotten luggage carts. That's when I heard it. A faint metallic clang echoed through the cavernous space. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It had come from somewhere deeper within the building, past the ticket counters and towards the gates. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, though the words sounded hollow. The desert was notorious for strange acoustics. Maybe a loose piece of metal had shifted in the breeze. I tried to believe it, but the sound had been too deliberate, too sharp. My flashlight flickered again, and I gave it a frustrated shake. The last thing I needed was to be stuck in the dark in a place like this. The clang came again, this time followed by a soft, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. Wind, I repeated, louder this time, as if saying it more forcefully would make it true. But deep down, I knew better. I moved cautiously, my boots making muted thuds on the cracked tiles. The sound had come from the direction of Gate 5, where a flickering overhead sign still displayed Departures, Flight 217 Denver. The scraping noise returned, closer now. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area with my flashlight. Dust motes swirled in a beam, but nothing else moved. Yet the noise persisted, growing louder, almost purposeful, as if it were following me. I gripped the flashlight tightly, telling myself to stay calm. Old buildings make noises, I thought. It's probably just something shifting. But even as I tried to rationalize, my instinct screamed that something was wrong. I approached the source of the sound, a narrow hallway leading to a cluster of gates. The door to Gate 5 was partially ajar, swinging lazily as if pushed by an unseen hand. The scraping noise had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic creaking. "Hello?" My voice echoed in the silence, sounding far more confident than I felt. The only response was the creak of the door, moving slowly back and forth. A chill prickled the back of my neck as I stepped closer, shining my flashlight through the gap. Beyond the door was a waiting area, the chairs arranged in neat rows, though many were rusted or broken. In the far corner, a suitcase lay open, its contents spilled across the floor, clothes and papers scattered as if abandoned in haste. The unease I'd been trying to suppress finally took hold, twisting into fear. The air felt colder here, unnaturally so. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and for a moment I considered turning back. But the clang came again, louder and more insistent, echoing from somewhere beyond the waiting area. My curiosity battled with my better judgment. Taking a deep breath, I pushed through the door, convincing myself it was nothing more than a rusted hinge or a piece of loose debris. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting just ahead. The cold intensified as I passed through the creaking door into the waiting area. My flashlight illuminated rows of rusting chairs, their faded upholstery covered in a fine layer of dust. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of the wind howling through the shattered windows. As I scanned the room, my light landed on something out of place, a worn, leather-bound book resting on a nearby seat. It looked oddly pristine compared to the decay around it, as though it had been recently placed there. I approached cautiously, my footsteps unnervingly loud in the stillness. The book's cover was cracked with age, the edges frayed, but the embossed letters were still legible: Flight Log, Desert Skies. A chill ran down my spine as I reached out and picked it up. The leather was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. I flipped it open, and the pages, yellowed and brittle, gave off the faint scent of mildew. The entries were written in neat, precise handwriting, chronicling flights dating back to the 1950s. At first, the notes seemed mundane: dates, times, and destinations, accompanied by short comments about weather conditions and crew performance. But as I flipped further, the tone began to change. June 12, 1968, unexplained turbulence over the desert. Instruments malfunctioned briefly, but landed safely. September 3, 1969, passenger reported seeing lights following the plane. Crew dismissed it as a reflection. April 25, 1971, lost contact with tower for 10 minutes. No explanation upon landing. Crew visibly shaken. The entries grew increasingly strange, culminating in one that made my breath catch. June 12, 1973, Flight 217 to Denver. Something is wrong. Passengers panicked. Radio dead. Can see the runway but can't seem to land. Writing this in case we don't make it. God help us all. The penmanship wavered toward the end, the ink smudged as if the writer's hand had been trembling. The page was stained with what looked like water or tears. My mind raced. Flight 217, wasn't that the same flight listed on the gate sign? I stared at the book, my hands trembling. It felt heavier now, as though the weight of its history had settled into my arms. The silence around me seemed to thicken, and I swore I heard faint whispers, just on the edge of perception. I quickly scanned the room, my heart pounding. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were closing in. For a moment, I debated putting the book back and leaving this cursed place. But curiosity won. Stuffing the logbook into my bag, I turned to leave the waiting area. As I did, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the terminal, followed by what sounded like hurried footsteps. I froze, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me alone again in the oppressive silence. Alone, or so I thought. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just disturbed something that wasn't meant to be found. Something that had been waiting, hidden in the shadows, for far too long. The night was thick with an unsettling quiet as I stepped back into the hallway. The logbook, now safely tucked in my bag, felt like an anchor pulling me down. My thoughts raced, swirling around the strange entries I had just read. Flight 217, was that a coincidence? Was this the same flight that had disappeared? I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought, but my feet moved almost of their own accord, pulling me towards the back exit of the terminal. The faintest sliver of moonlight spilled through the broken windows, casting distorted shadows along the walls. I hesitated for a moment. I'd been inside the terminal for what felt like hours, but my watch showed only a few minutes had passed since I entered. Time was starting to feel fluid, warped by the eerie presence of this place. The exit doors were heavy, groaning as I pushed them open. A gust of cold air greeted me, sending a shiver down my spine. The runway stretched before me, a long, desolate strip of asphalt vanishing into the night. The faint outline of the hangars loomed on either side, their windows dark and empty. My flashlight swept over the tarmac, illuminating the debris scattered across it, twisted metal, broken equipment, and old markings on the ground. But it wasn't the debris that caught my attention. It was a figure, standing motionless at the far end of the runway. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just a shadow cast by one of the hangars. But as I focused, the figure became clearer. A man, dressed in a pilot's uniform, stood perfectly still, facing the horizon. His face was obscured by the dark, but the outline of his silhouette was unmistakable. I blinked, unsure if what I was seeing was real. The figure didn't move, not even to acknowledge the light of my flashlight. It was as though he were frozen in place, a part of the night itself. A sudden gust of wind kicked up, causing the dust on the runway to swirl in a whirlpool around the figure. I stepped forward, my heart racing. "Hey!" I called out, my voice louder than I intended, echoing across the empty runway. The figure didn't respond. He didn't even shift, remaining perfectly still, as though unaware of my presence or perhaps deliberately ignoring me. I took another step, the cold wind biting at my skin. Something in my gut told me I was about to cross a line I couldn't come back from. But the figure beckoned me, or so it seemed. A strange, magnetic pull that tugged at me, urging me to come closer. But before I could take another step, the figure vanished. One moment he was there, frozen in place, and the next, he had melted into the darkness as if he had never existed at all. The air around me seemed to snap back into place, the silence returning as though nothing had happened. I stood there, staring into the blackness where the figure had been, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of my imagination? But I knew it wasn't. I had seen him, clear as day. And now he was gone, swallowed up by the desert night. The cold feeling in the pit of my stomach twisted tighter, and for the first time since arriving, I felt the weight of a terrible realization pressing down on me. This airport, this place, was far more than just a relic. It was a doorway, one that I had unwittingly stepped through. And whatever waited for me here had no intention of letting me leave unscathed. The air inside the terminal had grown unnervingly still, the kind of silence that presses in on your chest, making each breath feel like a conscious effort. As I stood on the runway, the remnants of the strange figure still fresh in my mind, a new sensation began to creep over me. It was subtle at first, a slight chill on the back of my neck, but soon it became undeniable. I turned back toward the terminal, feeling an odd pull, like the building itself was calling me. The wind had died down completely, leaving only the sound of my footsteps crunching on the tarmac. The door I had come through slammed shut behind me with a hollow thud, but I hadn't seen anyone else around. A shiver ran down my spine as I reached for the handle and pulled it open again. The moment I stepped back inside, I felt it. The temperature had dropped. It was more than just a cool breeze. It felt like something was leaching the warmth from the room. The air was dense, thick with cold, and the hairs on my arms stood straight. The oppressive heat of the Arizona desert felt a world away, replaced by an unnatural chill that was beginning to sink into my bones. I looked around, scanning the empty terminal for any signs of what might be causing the sudden drop. The walls seemed to sweat condensation, beads of moisture hanging like droplets of fog. The dim light flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I moved deeper into the terminal, my breath now visible in the freezing air. Each exhale puffed out in small, misty clouds, swirling into the darkness before vanishing. There was no rational explanation for this. The desert heat outside should have kept the interior warm, even in the dead of night. But this was something else. A coldness that felt ancient, rooted deep in the foundation of the place. It was as if the airport itself had been waiting for someone or something to arrive, and now that it had, the temperature was dropping to match its icy expectations. My flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams that only seemed to add to the unsettling atmosphere. I tried to steady my breath, but it came out in quick bursts, betraying my growing unease. The shadows felt deeper here, more alive. The once inviting chairs now seemed to lean toward me, their empty seats mocking my presence. I pulled my jacket tighter around my body, but it didn't help. The cold was seeping through the fabric, crawling along my skin, sinking into my very bones. It wasn't the kind of cold that could be chased away by a fire or a heater. This was something far more sinister. I stepped back toward the counter where I had found the logbook earlier, hoping to find something else, any clue, any explanation that might help me make sense of this. But my eyes couldn't focus. The cold and the suffocating darkness were making it difficult to think. The air hummed with a quiet tension, as though the very atmosphere were charged with a presence I couldn't see. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A soft, whispering sound. It was too faint to make out at first, but then it grew clearer, though still unintelligible. The sound seemed to echo from the walls themselves, as if they were speaking in voices that didn't belong to the living. My pulse quickened. The whispers grew louder, too soft to be coming from any human, but unmistakably there. It wasn't the wind, this was something else, something far more unnerving. "Hello?" I called into the dark, my voice shaky. It felt weak, swallowed up by the overwhelming cold. No answer. Just the faint rustle of something moving, like a fabric brushing against stone, or maybe footsteps, far off and muffled. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, the weight of unseen eyes. And the whispers grew louder still. The cold in the terminal had intensified to an unbearable level, pressing down on me from all sides. Every breath I took turned into mist, swirling in the air like vapor from some forgotten dream. I was beginning to feel like an intruder in this place, a trespasser in a world that had long been left behind. The whispers continued, now louder, as though the very walls themselves were alive with voices. But they weren't human voices, not entirely. They felt hollow, distant, like echoes from a time that should have been forgotten. I turned toward the counter, clutching the edge for support as my legs grew weaker, the cold gnawing at my strength. The radio, which I had previously assumed was broken, crackled to life. It was sudden, sharp, and filled the silence of the terminal like a thunderclap. The static hissed for a moment, and then a voice, muffled and distorted, cut through the noise. Flight 217, we've lost contact. Tower, can't hear you. Please respond. The transmission sputtered out, only to be replaced by another burst of static, then a series of unintelligible words. The voice sounded desperate, frightened, as though the speaker knew what was coming but couldn't stop it. I froze, my heart racing as I recognized the words, Flight 217. The same flight that had been recorded in the logbook. Tower, this is Flight 217. We can't land. It's not right. It's not. Oh God, it's... The message broke off abruptly, the radio falling back into a steady hiss. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I reached for the radio, my fingers trembling as I turned the dial, desperate to pull in some kind of signal, some form of coherent communication. But all I got was more static. Then, as if in response to my desperation, another transmission crackled through the air. I'm not going to make it. The lights are following us. Can you see them? There. The voice cut off mid-sentence, and all I could hear was a long, drawn-out screech of feedback. I yanked the radio from the counter and slammed it down, the sharp sound echoing through the empty terminal. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the whispers returned. They had grown louder, more distinct, as though the voices were drawing closer. They weren't speaking in any language I knew, but they were undeniably real. The words were garbled, distorted, but I could feel the weight of them in the air, like a fog that refused to lift. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The terminal stretched out before me, but now the darkness seemed deeper. It pressed in on me, suffocating. Every shadow appeared to move, and the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps reverberated through the room, though no one was there. The whispers were louder now, almost like a chant, repeating, overlapping, becoming unintelligible. Then, suddenly, the air shifted again. The radio crackled once more, but this time it was not a transmission, it was the unmistakable sound of a plane's engines, distant but growing closer. The sound was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, like it was speeding toward me. I swung the flashlight toward the door leading to the runway. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow, something moving just beyond the threshold of the door. The shape was indistinct, but the sound of the engines was unmistakable, growing louder with every passing second, as though a plane was coming in for a landing. But that didn't make sense. The airport had been abandoned for decades. There were no planes. No flights. But then, the shadow on the runway took form. A figure, dressed in a pilot's uniform, walked steadily across the tarmac. I blinked, and the figure was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. The engines, which had been so clear moments before, fell silent. The air became still once again, heavy and oppressive. I felt the whispers rise in volume around me, and I realized with growing horror that they were no longer just voices. They were a presence, a force, reaching out from the past, desperate to make itself known. And the man, the pilot, was only one of many. He had walked across the runway, but now he was somewhere else. Somewhere closer. I wasn't alone. The voices, the sounds, the echoes, they had never left. They were always here. And now, they were watching me. The cold air around me began to feel thicker, almost viscous, like it was pulling me in. My pulse quickened with every passing second, but despite my fear, I felt rooted in place, as though something invisible had anchored me to the floor. The whispers had faded into an eerie silence once again, leaving only the hum of the old, broken lights overhead. I glanced down at my watch, expecting to see maybe an hour or so had passed since the radio transmissions and the appearance of the shadowy pilot. but the time on my watch made no sense. It had been nearly 5 hours. 5 hours. I had only entered the terminal what felt like moments ago, not more than an hour at most. How could so much time have passed? I looked around, as if expecting the walls to offer some explanation. The terminal appeared unchanged, still as desolate and abandoned as it had been when I first arrived. Yet something in the air was different now, something I couldn't quite place. The reality of the place felt off, like it was bending around me. I walked back toward the counter, my mind spinning with confusion. The logbook was still there, but it felt farther away somehow, as if the space between me and it had widened. My fingers grazed the old paper, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. I needed something, anything, to ground me in the present. I checked my phone, desperate for a sign of normalcy. No service. Of course. But the time was still ticking, even though I couldn't make sense of it. I glanced back at the terminal windows, expecting the world outside to still be dark. But when I looked, the sky was lighter, like dawn was approaching. It couldn't be. I had been in the terminal for hours. I had seen the time on my watch. How could the night have passed so quickly? I walked toward the door again, pushing it open, and was met with the cold rush of air, the same chill that had greeted me earlier. The runway, once bathed in shadows, was now bathed in the pale light of early morning. But I knew it wasn't dawn. I knew the passage of time had been twisted in ways that defied explanation. A deep sense of unease settled in my chest. I turned back to the terminal, staring at the empty, lifeless walls. Something was terribly wrong. This place didn't operate on normal time. It wasn't just abandoned, it was locked in some kind of paradox, where time stretched and warped, refusing to let me leave. I stepped back inside the terminal, half expecting to find everything had changed again. But it hadn't. It was the same as before, dusty, decaying, and uninhabited. Yet, as I moved deeper into the building, I could feel the sensation of time slipping further out of my grasp. I looked at my watch again. It had advanced even further. Hours had gone by. And yet, in my mind, only minutes had passed. The strange distortion of time was not only unsettling, it was beginning to feel personal. This place was manipulating me, playing with my perception of reality. The feeling of being trapped in a cycle, unable to escape, grew stronger with every tick of the clock. I tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself that I was just disoriented, that maybe I was tired, that I had simply lost track of time. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. The airport had its claws in me, and it wasn't letting go. I moved back to the counter, my mind racing for answers. The whispers began again, so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but their presence was unmistakable. They were all around me now, echoing through the terminal. Each one a reminder that time wasn't just playing tricks on me, it was rewriting itself around me. I grabbed the logbook again, but this time, the pages felt colder than before. I flipped through the pages quickly, not wanting to linger on any one part, but a particular phrase caught my eye. It was a date. November 15th. Lost time. I stopped, the words hanging in the air like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed some invisible line, that I was no longer just a visitor to this place. I was now a part of it, caught in its web of confusion and distortion. The whispering voices grew louder, rising into an unsettling crescendo. The distortions in time were beginning to affect me, clouding my thoughts and trapping me further. I could feel the seconds dragging, stretching into an eternity, and yet I couldn't leave. I glanced back toward the door, my heartbeat quickening. Could I escape? Or was I doomed to remain here, forever caught in this strange loop? The cold, the whispers, the unexplainable passage of time, everything was beginning to blur together into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on to my sanity. Time was slipping away, and with it, my grip on reality. I stumbled back from the counter, the pages of the logbook slipping from my hands as my breath quickened. My mind was spinning. The distortion in time, the whispers, and the strange feeling of being trapped, everything felt too much to process. My eyes darted around the terminal as though expecting something, anything, to offer me an explanation. But all I saw was emptiness. Then, a sound cut through the silence, sharp and distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing across the hard, cracked floor of the terminal. My heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking it. The sound was too real, too present to be the product of my mind. I held my breath, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I turned my head toward the source of the noise. The runway door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. And through that darkness, I saw it. A figure. A man, tall and cloaked in a dark, worn pilot's uniform, was walking slowly toward the runway. His footsteps seemed to reverberate through the terminal, filling the air with a heavy, hollow sound. The figure didn't hurry. He moved with purpose, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. But there was something wrong about him. He wasn't real, not in the way you or I were. His form flickered, fading and reappearing as though he was slipping in and out of focus. The edges of his figure seemed to melt into the air, his face hidden in the shadows of his old-fashioned aviator's cap. Yet, there was an undeniable sense of recognition. The pilot was heading toward the same runway I had seen earlier, the one that had once seemed abandoned and silent. But now, it was alive with the presence of this ghostly figure. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, as if something invisible was holding me in place. My breath came in shallow bursts as I watched him approach, his every step measured and purposeful. The air around me seemed to grow colder still, and the sound of his footsteps echoed louder in my ears. I wanted to shout out, to call to him, to ask who he was and why he was here. But the words wouldn't come. The silence was too thick, too oppressive. All I could do was watch, unable to tear my eyes away from the spectral figure moving slowly toward the runway. He reached the door, his form flickering again, this time almost vanishing entirely into the darkness. He stopped just at the threshold, standing perfectly still, facing the runway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a strange sound filled the air. It wasn't a voice, no, this was something different. It was the distant hum of a plane's engines, faint but unmistakable. The pilot tilted his head as though listening, and then, with a deliberate movement, he turned toward the runway and began to walk again. But the runway wasn't real. Not in the way I had thought. It wasn't solid, it was an illusion, a fragment of the past bleeding through into the present. As the pilot moved further along, his figure began to fade even more, becoming less substantial, less human. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, he was gone. The cold in the air seemed to intensify, the temperature dropping further as the last traces of his presence evaporated into the nothingness of the runway. I was left standing there, in the middle of the terminal, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. Had it been real? Or had I imagined it? I glanced back toward the door, the place where the pilot had stood. The runway was empty again, the faintest trace of the figure vanishing into the shadows of the past. There was no sign of him now. No footsteps, no sound. Just the same cold, empty space. But I knew it hadn't been a hallucination. The figure, the footsteps, they were real, and they were part of something much darker, something that I was only beginning to understand. The airport was alive in ways I couldn't explain, pulling me deeper into its grip, each encounter with its ghostly inhabitants leaving me more confused, more fearful. The whispers returned again, rising in volume, and I felt them closing in around me. The pilot, whatever he was, wasn't the only one. There were more of them, trapped in this place, forever walking the runways, reliving their last moments over and over again. And now, I was one of them. I could feel my heart beating erratically, every thought a reminder that I wasn't alone. The echoes of the pilot's footsteps still reverberated in my mind, a sound that refused to fade, like it was permanently etched into the air around me. I stood frozen in place, my eyes darting around the terminal, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. It had been real, there was no denying it. The figure, the pilot, the impossible distortion of time. But as the coldness in the terminal intensified and the whispers grew louder, a terrifying realization began to seep into my consciousness. This airport, it wasn't just abandoned. It was haunted. The word itself sounded absurd in my head, but it was the only explanation that fit. This place wasn't just a ruin, it was a prison for something that had been trapped here long ago. The echoes of the past, voices, figures, distorted time, all pointed toward the same conclusion. This was no ordinary airport. This was a place of endless repetition, a place where the dead couldn't rest. I forced myself to move, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The weight of the air around me seemed to drag me down, making every step feel like an impossible effort. My eyes kept darting toward the runway door, half expecting to see that same pilot appear again, but the door remained still, silent. Yet the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I walked toward the terminal windows, hoping for a glimpse of the outside world, something to reassure me that I hadn't crossed some invisible line into another dimension. But when I looked outside, I saw nothing but the endless stretch of runway, bathed in pale light. The world beyond the glass felt distant, unreachable. Time outside the airport felt like another world entirely, disconnected from the distortion inside. It was then that I heard it again, the hum of distant engines. Soft at first, but growing louder, like an approaching plane. But there was no plane, I reminded myself. No planes ever came here. I glanced around nervously, but no one was there. It was just the sounds, the whispers, and the cold presence of something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. I approached the counter again, my hand trembling as I touched the worn surface. The logbook was still there, its pages curling slightly at the edges. The scribbles from the pilots. The same names, the same dates. But something about them had changed, or perhaps I was just seeing them with a clearer understanding. The entries no longer seemed like random notes. They were a record of people who had come here, lost, perhaps never to leave. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just an abandoned airport. It was a place where people were trapped, their final moments replaying over and over again in an endless loop. The pilots, the crew, even the passengers, they were all caught in this unrelenting cycle, unable to escape, forever bound to the terminal and the runway. And I, too, was becoming part of it. I could feel it in my bones, this growing sense that I wasn't just observing this place. I was slowly becoming one with it. The airport wasn't just haunted by ghosts, it was a place where time itself had fractured, where the dead walked and the living were left to join them. I tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things. It had to be stress, exhaustion, maybe even the cold that was making me paranoid. But deep down, I knew the truth. The longer I stayed here, the harder it would be to leave. I stepped back, unable to tear my eyes away from the logbook. The whispers had intensified again, but now they were no longer distant. They were close, too close, like they were right next to me. I could hear them clearly now, fragments of words drifting into my consciousness. Lost time, never leave, trapped. The temperature dropped further until my breath was visible in the air. I turned sharply toward the door, almost certain I would see the figure of the pilot again. But there was nothing. The runway remained dark, empty. Yet, the unease only grew. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone from the moment I stepped foot in this place. I had been drawn here by forces beyond my understanding. Forces that now had me in their grip. The airport, with its dilapidated walls and hollow echoes, was a tomb that had no intention of letting anyone go. And I realized then, with chilling clarity, that I wasn't just a visitor. I was a prisoner. I had come seeking answers, but instead, I had found something far worse. The airport was not just haunted by the dead. It was alive, in a way, feeding on the living, trapping them in its timeless grip. And as I stood there, staring into the darkness beyond the terminal windows, I knew I was no longer just an observer. I was becoming part of the ghostly presence that haunted this place. There was no escape. The quiet of the terminal had become a suffocating weight, pressing down on my chest with every passing second. I could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, the sensation that the airport had its own dark history, a history that I was now entwined in. There was no turning back. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize the strange events I had witnessed. Perhaps there was an explanation, a logical reason for everything I had seen so far. But deep down, I knew that what I was experiencing wasn't something I could simply explain away. The airport was more than just an abandoned structure. It was a place steeped in tragedy, in loss, in untold stories. The whispers, the cold, the distorted time, all of it was tied to something greater. I needed answers, something to make sense of the nightmares creeping into my reality. The logbook was the only clue I had, but it felt like a breadcrumb trail that led deeper into darkness. I knew I had to uncover more, to understand what had really happened here. I made my way to the back of the terminal, to a small storage room I had spotted earlier. Dust-covered boxes were stacked high against the walls, some marked with labels I couldn't read. My fingers brushed over the faded markings, the dryer carrying the faint scent of aged paper and mildew. I pulled one box down carefully and opened it, half expecting it to fall apart in my hands. Inside, I found more books, more files, tattered documents chronicling the airport's operations, its history. I began to sift through the pages, each one filled with references to flights, to schedules, to the names of crews and passengers who had passed through this airport over the years. At first, it seemed mundane, a collection of routine records. But as I dug deeper, I began to find something that chilled me to my core. The accidents. The more I read, the clearer the pattern became. There were dozens of crashes, near disasters, and disappearances linked to the airport, some long before it had been abandoned. The files were filled with names, dates, and locations of tragic events that had occurred in and around the area. But as I pieced the information together, a disturbing realization began to form. Many of these accidents had been eerily similar. pilots had lost control during seemingly routine flights. Passengers had vanished without a trace. I found an entry that stood out, a note scrawled hastily in the margins of one of the older reports. It mentioned a crash that had occurred on November 15th, a flight that had gone missing without any distress signals, the wreckage never found. The pilot, a man by the name of James Halliday, had been the last to communicate before the plane disappeared into the night. The report listed him as presumed dead, but it was the date that sent a shiver down my spine. November 15th. The same date I had seen in the logbook earlier. I flicked through more pages, desperate for more answers. It was as if I had stumbled upon a tragic, forgotten chapter of the airport's history, one that had been buried under layers of dust and time. Each page seemed to bleed into the next, telling the same story of loss and confusion, of inexplicable disappearances. A cold sweat formed on my brow as I reached the last file. It was dated just days before the airport had been officially shut down. The accident it described was the most devastating of them all. An entire flight crew, including the pilot and passengers, had vanished mid-flight. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing. Just an empty sky. I leaned back, my mind racing with questions. Had these accidents been the result of mechanical failures, bad weather, human error? Or was something darker at play? The more I read, the more I began to suspect that these deaths weren't just accidents, they were part of a pattern, a curse that had taken hold of the airport. I couldn't help but wonder, had the pilots, the crew, the passengers, all been doomed to relive their final moments over and over again? Was that the true nature of this place? And if so, what did that mean for me? Was I now a part of this cursed cycle? The more I learned, the more questions I had. But one thing was clear, I was no longer just an observer. I was caught in something far larger than myself, something that had taken root in this airport long ago and refused to let go. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the knowledge I had uncovered pressing down on me. I needed to get out. But I knew, deep down, that leaving wouldn't be as simple as walking out the door. The airport had its grip on me now, and no amount of research or reflection was going to change that. The air in the terminal seemed to thicken as I stood up, my hands trembling as I returned the files to the box. Something in the back of my mind told me that the answers I had found were only the beginning. The real horrors, the true nature of this place, were still hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to uncover them. And with that realization, I knew I was far from safe. I stood there, my mind spinning as I glanced from the files back to the old pilot's logbook that lay open on the counter. The connection between the two was undeniable. As I flipped through the worn pages of the logbook once more, the faint scribbles and faded ink seemed to jump off the page, now laden with new significance. I hadn't noticed it before, but now, in light of the research I had uncovered, the entries seemed almost prophetic, each one a chilling link to the tragic disappearances I had read about. The first entry that caught my attention was dated June 23rd. The logbook entry was brief, but it was unmistakable: lost control over desert, no distress call. I blinked and my blood ran cold. I had just read about a crash that happened in the exact same location, the desert that surrounded the airport. The flight was scheduled as routine, but the pilot's sudden disappearance was never explained. No wreckage was found, and no distress signals had been recorded. The correlation was undeniable. This was no mere coincidence. I turned the page, almost desperately, flipping through the entries one by one. Each one seemed more haunting than the last. There, written in the same hasty script, was another entry: November 15th, lost flight, never found. My breath caught in my throat as the words sank in. This matched the date of the infamous disappearance I had found in the files. The flight had gone missing without a trace, and now, here it was, recorded in the logbook. The same pilot's handwriting. The same disjointed thoughts. I felt a rising dread as I realized that the logbook didn't just contain flight records, it was a record of disappearances. I turned the pages faster now, the flicker of the dim lights above making everything feel unreal, like I was trapped in some kind of twisted dream. There were more entries, many of them cryptic, some barely legible, but they all pointed to the same thing. Flights that had vanished. Pilots who had gone missing. Another entry caught my eye, March 4th, engine failure, no survivors. Crew lost. The words seemed to leap off the page, sending a shiver down my spine. This was one of the accidents I had seen earlier in the records. The file had spoken of an engine failure, but no wreckage had ever been found. The same fate had befallen the crew, vanished without a trace. Yet here it was, the same pilot's handwriting, documenting the event as if it had been nothing more than a routine note. I swallowed hard, the air around me growing heavier with every word I read. There was a connection here, a pattern, and it was growing harder to deny. The logbook wasn't just a personal diary. It was a graveyard, a final testament to pilots and crews lost to the shadows of this airport. I felt a strange mix of fascination and terror. These entries weren't just the recollections of a pilot. They were the last moments of the people who had walked these halls and taken to the skies, never to return. And now, those same spirits lingered, bound to this forsaken place. The most chilling part, though, was yet to come. I flipped a few more pages, my hands trembling as I reached the final few entries. They were dated just days before the airport had been officially shut down. The handwriting had become increasingly erratic, almost as if the pilot knew what was coming, as if he could feel the weight of his own fate drawing nearer. And then, in a frantic scrawl, the last entry read, "They won't leave. They never leave. We're stuck here, forever." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Stuck here, forever. Those words echoed in my mind, reverberating through the quiet terminal. I read them over and over, trying to understand their meaning. Who was the pilot referred to? And what did he mean by stuck here? The whispers that had been growing louder in the terminal suddenly seemed to intensify, swirling around me like a storm. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, as though something unseen was moving just beyond my sight. I felt an overwhelming sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath me had become unstable. My breath quickened as I tried to steady myself, but the air was thick with dread, heavy with the knowledge that the airport was not simply abandoned. It was alive with memories, with spirits that were not ready to let go. I closed the logbook with shaking hands, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. The connection between the entries in the logbook and the reported disappearances was no longer just a theory, it was a terrifying reality. The pilots, the passengers, and the crew all had become part of something much darker than a simple accident or tragedy. They were trapped here, repeating their last moments, lost in time. And now, I was inextricably tied to this cursed place. The whispers grew louder, their words now distinguishable. Leave, before it's too late. I wasn't sure if they were real, if they were coming from the air itself or from the ghosts who lingered in the corners of the terminal. But I knew one thing for certain, I had uncovered the horrifying truth. The airport wasn't just haunted, it was a place where time had broken, where the dead couldn't rest, and where the living were pulled into the same endless cycle. And as I stood there, staring at the logbook, I realized with sickening clarity that I was now a part of that cycle. The chill that had settled on my bones refused to dissipate as I clutched the logbook in my trembling hands. The airport felt alive with secrets, its very walls whispering to me, urging me to dig deeper. It was as if something, or someone, wanted me to uncover the truth, to piece together the puzzle of this cursed place. But with each discovery, the weight of what I had learned grew heavier, pressing on my chest like a constant reminder that I was being watched. As I turned away from the counter, my mind still reeling from the last entry in the logbook, I noticed something strange, a slight draft coming from a corner of the terminal I hadn't yet explored. The air was cooler there, but not just from the breeze. It felt different, as if it were moving in a deliberate pattern, guiding me towards something hidden. My curiosity, now a dangerous obsession, pulled me forward. I walked cautiously toward the source of the draft, my footsteps echoing through the otherwise silent terminal. The dim light flickered above me, casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked tile floor. As I reached the corner, I found an old wooden door, partially concealed behind a stack of dusty crates and long-forgotten luggage. It had gone unnoticed in all my previous visits, hidden in plain sight. The door was heavy, its metal handle tarnished with age. I hesitated for a moment, the sense of dread that had been growing inside me intensifying with every passing second. What was behind this door? What new horrors awaited me? I had already uncovered more than I could have ever imagined, yet something told me that this hidden room held the final pieces of the puzzle, the ones that would explain the airport's dark history. With a deep breath, I reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, its ancient hinges protesting with every movement. A thick layer of dust hung in the air, disturbed by my intrusion. Inside, the room was even colder than the rest of the terminal, a bitter chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. The room was small, cramped, and smelled of mildew and decay. Shelves lined the walls, filled with rows of yellowed folders, old flight records, and stacks of brittle paper. The overwhelming scent of age and abandonment hung thick in the air, but my eyes were fixed on the files. My pulse quickened as I walked toward them, my heart racing with anticipation. The records were disorganized, some piled high and others shoved into corners, as though they had been hastily left behind. I began pulling out the nearest folder, my hand shaking with a mix of fear and excitement. The paper inside was old and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. I glanced over the first page, and my stomach lurched. It was a flight manifest, but not just any flight. This one was dated June 23rd, the same date as the entry in the logbook I had read earlier. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, the names of the passengers and crew members standing out like a grim list of the doomed. Among the names was the pilot I had read about, the same one who had written the entry in the logbook detailing the loss of control over the desert. The flight had been a scheduled flight, but something had gone horribly wrong. I couldn't stop myself from pulling out more folders, each one containing similar manifests, each one tied to a specific accident I had read about in the research. The same names appeared again and again, pilots, flight crews, passengers, all listed in flights that had ended in disaster. And with each manifest, the pattern became clearer. These flights, these crashes, weren't random. They were connected, bound together by an unseen force, an entity that had claimed the airport as its own. As I sorted through the files, a particular folder caught my attention. Unlike the others, it was sealed with a red wax emblem, its contents clearly marked as confidential. I hesitated for a moment before carefully breaking the seal, the tension in my chest growing unbearable. What was hidden inside this folder? What could be so important that it had been kept secret all these years? Inside, I found a letter from the airport's director, written to an unnamed official. The handwriting was neat, precise, but the words within it were disturbing. The letter described a series of unexplainable events occurring at the airport, incidents that the director could not rationalize, despite numerous investigations. There were mentions of time distortions, of ghostly apparitions, and even a reference to the spirits of the lost pilots. The letter concluded with a chilling sentence: "We are unable to stop them. They are trapped here, and they will never leave." The weight of the letter hung in the air, settling over me like a suffocating fog. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they were forming was one of pure horror. The airport had not only been a site of tragic accidents, it was a prison, a place where the dead were forced to relive their final moments, trapped in an endless cycle. And those who entered, like me, were doomed to become part of that cycle. I dropped the letter, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. This hidden room, filled with the lost history of the airport, was a final testament to those who had perished here. But now, the room felt more like a tomb, a place where the dead were not at rest, but where they were forever recorded, forever bound to the airport's dark legacy. I knew I had to leave. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer, but the pull of the airport's dark grip was too strong. It was as if the very walls of the terminal were alive, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The discovery of the hidden room had only deepened the mystery and the danger. The spirits of the lost pilots and passengers were still here, still lingering, and I feared that I was now one step closer to becoming part of their endless, tragic story. I had barely left the hidden room before I started to feel it, an overwhelming presence, like something was watching me. The dim light flickered again, casting long shadows across the terminal. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of dread that seemed to seep from the very walls. It was as if the place itself was aware of my every move, pulling me deeper into its twisted embrace. I paused, my hand still on the doorknob, unwilling to let go just yet. The eerie silence was almost suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. There was a deep, unsettling quiet that hung in the air, broken only by the distant hum of an old fan somewhere far off in the building. But even that sound seemed wrong. It wasn't steady, it didn't have the mechanical reliability of something that should be running. It pulsed, uneven, like a breathing thing. And then, I heard it. At first, it was just a whisper, so faint I thought I had imagined it. But it grew louder with each passing second. Soft at first, then clearer, more distinct. My name. Jason. Jason. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. The voice was unmistakable. It was a whisper, but it was coming from all around me, from deep within the walls, from the shadows in the corners of the room. It echoed in my head, reverberating through my skull as if the entire building was calling my name. I spun around, my eyes darting around the terminal. There was no one there. The room was still empty, the same cracked tiles and peeling wallpaper I had seen when I first arrived. But the whispering continued, growing louder, almost urgent now. Jason, you have to leave. I felt a cold shiver race up my spine, every hair on my body standing on end. My breath quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was impossible. There was no way anyone could be here. The airport had been abandoned for years. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but deep down, I knew this wasn't a trick of the wind or my imagination running wild. This was something else, something far more sinister. I stepped away from the door, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The whispers followed, weaving around me like an invisible web. They were everywhere now, echoing in the shadows, each one a faint, distorted voice, each one pulling at me, drawing me in. Jason, Don't stay. I spun again, my pulse racing as I tried to locate the source of the voices. But there was nothing. The terminal was silent, still, empty. Yet the voices persisted. Some were distant, as if coming from another time, another place. Others were closer, whispering in my ear, too close, too real. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of the whispers. I staggered backward, my feet stumbling over the cracked tile floor. The cold was unbearable now, a biting chill that seemed to cut right through my jacket. The whispers grew frantic and pleading, almost desperate. Please. Jason, leave now. I couldn't think. My mind was in turmoil, my thoughts scrambling for answers, for an explanation. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out the voices, but they continued, relentless, clawing their way into my mind. My breath came in short gasps as I struggled to stay grounded, to hold onto some shred of reality. I had to get out. I had to leave before the whispers pulled me under. I started walking toward the exit, my legs shaky, my thoughts clouded with fear. The whispers followed me, no matter where I went. It didn't matter how fast I moved or which direction I turned. They were everywhere, surrounding me like a swarm of insects. They called my name over and over again, the voices blending together, becoming a chorus of haunting, mournful cries. Jason, you're not supposed to be here. My hands trembled as I reached for the door, my fingers slipping as I fumbled to open it. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They pressed in on me from all sides. I felt like I was suffocating, drowning in the sound of my name being called over and over again. And then, as if the entire building had exhaled, the whispers stopped. There was silence again. The kind of silence that felt oppressive, like something was waiting, watching. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood in the doorway, half inside the terminal and half outside, unsure of what to do next. Was it over? Had I imagined it all? No. I knew deep down that I hadn't. I had heard them. The voices. The whispers. They were real. And I was not alone in this place. I stepped out into the cold desert air, the night sky overhead, dark and clouded. The eerie quiet outside was a stark contrast to the maddening whispers that had filled the terminal just moments ago. But even as I walked away from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that the airport was still calling me. The voices had stopped, but I knew, deep down, that they weren't gone. They would never be gone. I had awoken something ancient and restless that lingered in the shadows of the airport. And now, I was marked. I would never truly leave this place. Not really. And the voices would never stop calling my name. The cold air outside the terminal felt like a fleeting escape. As I walked away, the weight on my chest didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier. The desert night stretched out before me, vast and empty, the stars above like distant, cold witnesses to the terror I had just experienced. But there was no peace. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, watched by something that wasn't human. Something that existed only in the space between life and death. I had barely reached my car when I heard it, faint at first, like a breath carried on the wind. But it was no breeze. Leave, now. The voice came again, unmistakable in its urgency. My body froze in place, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. This time, it wasn't distant or echoing, it was right behind me, like a whisper in my ear, too real to ignore. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight, perhaps another lost wanderer or a misguided tourist. But there was nothing. The dark expanse of the runway lay before me, empty, desolate, and silent. No one was there. But the voice. It had come from the terminal. It had come from within the depths of the building, from somewhere I had just escaped. My legs felt like lead, my breath shallow as I slowly turned back to face the airport. The windows were dark, like eyes that had been shut, but I knew, deep down, that something was watching me. It was always watching. You have to go. They are waiting. This time, the voice was different. It was softer, almost mournful, but there was a chilling authority to it, an undeniable force, one that seemed to reverberate in the very air. It was as though the airport itself had spoken, as if the structure, the ghosts within it, had decided my fate. And it was not a kind one. My mind screamed for me to run, to flee from the airport and never look back. But my feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispers had left their mark on me, burrowing into my thoughts, twisting my every rational thought. Was I really hearing this? Or had the fear completely overtaken my senses? I forced myself to take a step forward, but my legs wavered beneath me. I couldn't move. The voice, so faint now it was almost a sigh, returned, but it no longer carried the same sense of urgency. It was heavy, final, as though it had been spoken by something that had lived for 1,000 years. Don't make the same mistake. I felt a wave of nausea crash over me as the words settled deep into my bones. There was something familiar about the voice. I couldn't place it, but it was haunting. As if I had heard it before. As if it had called to me from a place I had yet to reach, from a time that hadn't yet come. I turned away from the terminal again, but this time the decision wasn't mine. It was as though some invisible force was pushing me, guiding me. A part of me resisted, but another part, an insidious, terrified part, urged me to leave, to get in my car and drive far, far away. But I couldn't. I couldn't escape the airport. The whispers still filled the air around me, swirling in the wind like a storm ready to burst. The voice had said it, they were waiting. I clutched my car keys in my hand, my fingers trembling as I pressed them into the lock. A sudden sharp pain stung my chest, and I gasped, the air thick with dread. Something had changed. The darkness around me felt heavier now, more oppressive, like it was closing in from all sides. Leave, Jason, before it's too late. The voice was clearer now, stronger, coming from within the airport. But it wasn't a voice anymore. It was something more, a presence, a force that filled the empty spaces around me. It was as though the very earth beneath my feet had become alive, its pulse matching my own, beating in time with the terror that surged through me. In a panic, I unlocked the door of my car, throwing myself inside, the engine starting with a roar. I slammed the door shut behind me, pressing my foot to the gas as I pulled away from the airport. But even as I sped down the dark road, I felt it, the eyes on me. It was as though the airport was still there, still watching, still waiting. I had tried to leave, to escape, but deep in my heart, I knew that I hadn't truly left. The road stretched before me, empty and endless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the airport was still out there, a phantom that would never release its grip on me. The whispers followed me now, lingering in the corners of my mind, a warning that echoed with every mile I drove away. And in the silence of the desert night, I heard the last, haunting words. You'll never be free. Not while they wait. I thought I had escaped. I thought I had outrun the airport, left it far behind me in the rearview mirror as the endless desert stretched out ahead. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. The whispers had faded, but they left a lingering sense of unease that clung to my thoughts like a shadow. Something was following me, something I couldn't escape, no matter how far I went. I reached the edge of the small town hours later, my hands still trembling on the wheel. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an eerie light over the dusty streets. My mind was racing, replaying every moment I had spent in that terminal. The strange figure I had seen on the runway, the whispers, the cryptic warnings. It all felt like a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. I should have driven straight home, but I couldn't. Something kept pulling me back. I need to understand, to make sense of what I had seen. I couldn't ignore it. I had to go back. I turned the car around and headed back toward the airport. The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't stop myself. I knew I had to face whatever it was that had been haunting me. By the time I arrived, the place seemed even more desolate than before. The early morning light cast long shadows across the cracked runway, stretching toward the terminal like skeletal fingers. The building loomed in the distance, dark and oppressive, but it called to me. I parked near the entrance, the engine still running as I sat for a moment, gathering the strength to step out. The air felt different now, heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. It was as if the ground itself was saturated with the history of the place, with the lost souls that had once walked these halls. I shut off the engine, my heartbeat echoing in the silence. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady beneath me as I walked toward the terminal. The heavy doors stood before me, unmoving, like a gateway to another world. The moment I touched the handle, a chill ran through my body, the kind that comes from deep within the bones, as if the air around me had suddenly turned cold. The doors creaked open, and I stepped inside. The terminal was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. The air was still, too still, and the silence was deafening. But as I moved deeper into the terminal, something shifted in the shadows. I froze. A dark shape moved in the corner of my eye. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a fleeting movement, a blur in the periphery. But then it shifted again, slower this time, more deliberate. I spun toward it, but there was nothing there. The shadows danced along the walls, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways, but no one stood in them. There was no sound except for my breathing, loud and rapid in the stillness. "Is anyone there?" My voice broke the silence, but it was immediately swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the terminal. The shadows seemed to respond to my words, flickering as if alive. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, every step feeling heavier than the last. Another movement. A shape, a figure, no, it was more like a collection of dark tendrils, twisting and shifting in the dim light. The shapes didn't follow the natural laws of the space, they weren't bound to the walls or the floor. They moved like smoke, ethereal and intangible, but unmistakably real. They slithered across the room, slipping between pillars and across the floor, closing in on me. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows were alive, and they were moving toward me. Panic surged in my chest, and I turned to run. But my legs wouldn't cooperate, as if the very air had thickened, becoming solid, weighing me down. The dark shapes were getting closer, faster now, swirling in the corners of my vision like tendrils of smoke. I could feel their cold presence, pressing on me from every direction, and I knew, without a doubt, that they were not just shadows. They were something else. Something that had been trapped here, lingering in the terminal, waiting for someone to come. Waiting for me. I stumbled backward, my body shuddering with fear as the shapes grew larger, more defined. The shadows twisted into humanoid forms, their outlines faint but unmistakable. The figures were tall, towering over me, but they had no faces, just voids of darkness where their heads should have been. Their bodies were formless, rippling like liquid shadow, constantly changing shape, never staying the same. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in the suffocating atmosphere. My hands trembled as I searched for the door, any exit, anything to escape this nightmare. I was trapped in a place where the shadows came to life, where the lost souls of the past moved, restless and angry, waiting for something or someone to release them. A soft whisper drifted through the air, like a breath, a sigh, and I couldn't tell if it came from the shadows or from within me. You shouldn't have come back. The words were like a slap to my face, cold and sharp. The shadows shifted again, closing in, their movements faster now. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I had to get out, but it was too late. The terminal had swallowed me whole, and the shadows had come alive, ready to claim me as their own. The temperature plummeted the moment I stepped deeper into the terminal. It wasn't a gradual chill, it was sudden, an instant drop that sent a wave of ice through my veins. My breath caught in my throat, visible in the air before me, as if the very atmosphere had frozen in place. The cold was unnatural, sharp, like a hand on my skin made of nothing but pure frost. I rubbed my arms, trying to create some warmth, but it was futile. The cold seeped into my bones, creeping up my spine, curling around my neck. It felt like something was watching me, something far more ancient than the building itself, something older than the desert, older than the air I breathed. I took another step forward, but this time my feet barely moved. The floor beneath me felt like it was turning to ice. The chill gnawed at my legs, crawling upward as if the terminal itself was alive and reaching out to claim me. My heart raced, and I swore I could hear something faint, like the scratching of claws on concrete. I glanced down, but there was nothing. No marks. No signs. Then it happened. A coldness so intense that it sent a shock through my entire body. It was like a breath on the back of my neck, but more than that, it felt like fingers made of ice, reaching for me. I spun around, my heart pounding, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as if each strand was being pulled by an invisible force. There was no one behind me. The terminal was empty, its shadows stretching across the walls, but I could feel them now. I could feel the fingers, cold and relentless, grazing my skin. I gasped, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to escape. The air was thick with the presence of something unseen, something that moved with purpose, that was waiting for me. The cold hands followed me as I retreated further into the terminal. I could hear the sound of my own breath, shaky and shallow, but it was drowned by the low hum of the shadows, like the terminal itself was alive, its walls pulsing with an unseen rhythm. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the sensation. It's just the cold air, it's just the building settling, but deep down, I knew. This was no ordinary cold. This was a touch, a presence, something far older than the terminal, older than the air itself. I dared to glance over my shoulder again, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. The chill intensified, crawling up my spine until it settled at the base of my skull. I felt it again. A brush against my cheek, a feather-light touch, like cold fingers running along my skin. My skin prickled, goosebumps rising on my arms as the temperature around me dropped even further. No, this isn't just the air. I could almost feel the outlines of the invisible hands as they pressed against me, a constant pull, a pressure that seemed to constrict my chest. I clenched my fists, trying to ward it off, but it was no use. It was as though the cold had weight, a tangible force, one that pressed in on me from every angle. It was in the air, in the shadows, crawling through the floor beneath me. I swallowed hard, desperate for breath, but the icy sensation wasn't just on the surface. It reached deeper, into my very core. It felt like the cold was trying to freeze me from the inside, to stop my heart, to silence my breath. The darkness around me seemed to grow darker still, the edges of reality blurring as I staggered forward, trying to find the door, any escape. But every time I moved, I could feel it closer, those cold fingers, brushing across my skin, pressing against my body, sinking deeper into me. I heard something faint, a whisper like the crackling of ice, and then a voice, soft, but clear in the frozen air. "You can't leave. Not now." I froze in place. The voice wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it felt so real. The breath, the cold, it was all so real. The fingers on my skin, they weren't just hallucinations. They were something ancient, something that had been waiting here for years, waiting for a lost soul like mine. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the cold tightened around my throat, choking the sound before it could leave my lips. I tried to move, tried to run, but it was as if the floor had turned to ice beneath me, my feet slipping with every step. The door felt miles away, a distant promise that I could never reach. Then, a sudden sharp pain. It wasn't in my chest, but it felt like something inside me had cracked. Like a fracture spreading through my ribs. The cold fingers dug deeper, not just on my skin, but inside me now, squeezing, pushing, pulling. A pressure that threatened to break me. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, but all I could feel was the ice, the crushing cold. The shadows moved closer, circling me, pressing in from all sides. I was trapped. The cold was everywhere. And then, as if the shadows themselves had decided it was time, the cold hands vanished. The air around me returned to its normal chill. The pressure lifted. But the damage had already been done. I was no longer sure where the terminal ended and I began. The cold had taken a piece of me, and I wasn't sure I could ever get it back. I rose slowly, trembling, every part of me shaking with the after effects of the touch. I looked around, but the shadows were gone. Everything seemed normal again, like nothing had happened. But I knew better now. The terminal had claimed me, had touched me in ways I couldn't explain, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could last in this place. The shadows weren't done with me. Not yet. I stumbled forward, my heart still racing from the cold touch that had gripped me just moments before. The terminal felt heavier now, as if it had absorbed the fear and the frost. My mind was a blur, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. Was I imagining it all? Was this place truly haunted, or was I simply losing my grip on reality? The whispers had faded, but there was still a palpable presence around me, something waiting. Something that wasn't done with me yet. The air felt thick, like the weight of a storm hovering just out of reach. The shadows were no longer just dark corners in the room, they were shapes now, moving with purpose, almost as if they were watching me. I moved toward the center of the terminal, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The low hum that had filled the air earlier seemed to have intensified, now almost resembling a low drone, like the faint hum of an engine. It was distant, yet unmistakable, a sound that seemed to draw me closer to something I couldn't explain. That's when I saw him. He appeared in the far corner of the terminal, barely visible at first, just a figure in a shadow. I froze. My body went rigid, but my feet refused to move. The man was tall, dressed in an old flight uniform, the kind I had seen in the vintage photos of pilots from the early days of aviation. His face was obscured, just a vague outline, but his posture was unmistakably that of someone who had seen countless flights. The way he stood, shoulders squared, hands by his sides, was so precise, so professional, that for a moment I almost convinced myself he was just a person who had gotten lost in the airport. But there was something wrong. The figure didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge my presence, but I could feel the weight of his stare, heavy and intense, as though he were watching me from within the shadows. His outline was faint, like smoke, but I could see the uniform clearly. The old-fashioned cap, the crisp jacket, the winged insignia on his chest. I wanted to call out, to ask if he needed help, but the words wouldn't come. The air around me thickened again, the tension unbearable. It was as if time had stopped. There was no sound, no movement, just me and the pilot, locked in a moment that didn't make sense. Then, as if stirred by some unseen force, the figure began to move. It was slow, deliberate, like he was walking toward me but never quite fully stepping into the light. He was gliding, his feet barely making a sound, as though he was floating above the ground. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "Can you hear me?" The voice, when it came, was soft, distant, like a whisper through a fog. It wasn't like any sound I'd ever heard. It felt like it was inside my head, not in the room, but echoing from somewhere far beyond. The words were broken, fragmented, as though they had been carried through a great distance, lost in the winds of time. I took a step forward, my body trembling. I wanted to respond, but my throat felt tight, the words stuck. The pilot's form wavered, flickering like a shadow in the dim light, as if he was fading in and out of existence. His figure grew more solid, only to dissolve again, slipping between realms. "Where are you going?" The voice came again, and this time I understood it completely. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. A demand. The air around me grew colder, the hum of the terminal louder, as if it were responding to the captain's call. I didn't know what to say. What could I say to a ghost, a figure trapped in this endless space between life and death? I wanted to run, to leave this place behind, but my feet were rooted to the ground, frozen in place. Something about his presence held me there. The captain's face finally came into focus. It was a blur at first, but then it sharpened, revealing a man in his mid-40s, with dark, sharp features and a look of determination etched into his face. His eyes were clouded, hollow, as if they had seen too much. But there was a sadness in them, a deep, aching sadness that seemed to radiate from his very being. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 lost hours, 1,000 restless nights. The words wrapped themselves around me, suffocating, pressing in on my chest. I finally found my voice, my breath ragged. "Who are you? What happened here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, as though it took great effort. The air crackled with energy as his fingers pointed toward the far end of the terminal. The runway. His voice was barely audible, but the intensity in his words burned through the silence. They never left. They never reached the sky. The cold around me intensified, a sharp bite to the air. I looked where he had pointed, my eyes straining to see through the dim light. There, at the end of the terminal, the runway stretched out into nothingness, a void that seemed to swallow everything it touched. The captain's figure flickered once more, his image growing fainter, as if his presence was being pulled back into the shadows. "Please, leave, before it's too late." His voice faded, growing softer with every word. I took a step toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Wait. Please, tell me what happened here." But the captain was already gone. In his place, only the emptiness remained. The shadows that had once moved with purpose were now still, their presence barely a whisper in the air. The low hum had quieted, and for a moment everything seemed as it had been when I first entered, silent, desolate, empty. But something had changed. I could still feel the weight of his words pressing on me. The captain had tried to warn me. He had tried to communicate, to share the story of the forgotten souls, the pilots who had never returned. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into that same fate, trapped between worlds, destined to be one more lost flyer, forgotten in the darkness. The captain's departure left me shaken, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. His words, cryptic yet filled with an urgency I couldn't ignore, gnawed at me. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my mind replaying the brief encounter, his warnings echoing in my head. The runway, what did he mean? The flight records I had discovered earlier, the logbook, everything seemed to be connected. There was something about this place, something ancient and malevolent, that had ensnared not only the pilots but the very soul of the airport itself. I walked slowly towards the far end of the terminal, my footsteps now more hesitant, cautious. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and though the cold had subsided, the weight of something unseen still hung heavily around me. It wasn't just the eerie atmosphere that had taken hold of the terminal, it was a sense of inevitability, like a great force was pulling me in, slowly, relentlessly, towards something I could no longer escape. At the far end, near the runway, I noticed something that had eluded me earlier, a door. It was hidden behind a stack of old crates, nearly blending into the walls, its paint chipped and faded. There were no signs or markings on it, just an ordinary metal door that seemed out of place in the otherwise decaying terminal. I approached it slowly, curiosity and dread mingling in my chest. Something was drawing me here, something I couldn't explain. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. The chill returned suddenly, a cold breeze that brushed past me as though it were a warning. I gripped the handle tightly and turned. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward into darkness. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in on me as I descended. My heart hammered in my chest, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to match the eerie hum that once again filled the air. This wasn't just the airport anymore. This felt like a descent into the very heart of its curse, into the place where the spirits of the lost pilots were bound to relive their final moments, trapped between worlds. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with old aviation memorabilia, old posters, faded photos of planes in flight, and strange, weathered maps. But what caught my attention most was the sound. The faint hum of engines, the soft whir of propellers, and then voices. The voices of men and women, faint but clear, talking to one another. No, not talking. Commanding. Altitude 2,000 feet, steady as she goes, one voice said, filled with authority. Prepare for descent, Captain. The voices came in quick succession, overlapping each other as if multiple conversations were happening all at once. I walked further down the hall, drawn by the strange, hypnotic pull of the voices. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. It was the pilot from earlier, his face sharp and determined, his uniform pristine but now drenched in a cold sweat. He was standing at the door of a small, cramped cockpit. The door swung open slowly, revealing the interior, a familiar sight, filled with dials and buttons, a seat positioned just before a vast expanse of glass. But the glass was cracked. The view beyond was no longer the horizon, it was dark, endless, like the night sky stretching on forever. I froze. The captain turned toward me, his face empty, eyes hollow. He was speaking again, but this time it wasn't to me. Prepare for takeoff. His words were mechanical, lifeless, as if he was reciting an order, but there was no one else there to hear it. The air in the room grew colder, and the hum of the engines grew louder, a low drone that vibrated in my chest. I stepped forward, compelled to see more. I had to understand. The moment I crossed the threshold of the cockpit, a wave of vertigo hit me, and the world seemed to tilt. The cockpit blurred and shifted, the pilot's image wavering in and out of focus. The voices continued to echo, louder now, as if I had been pulled into a memory. A memory from another time. Another place. This wasn't just a dream. The plane's interior began to flicker, and I saw it, the instruments, the view, the terrified faces of the crew. I felt the strain of the cockpit, the unease that rippled through the air as the captain's hand hovered over the control panel. He wasn't alone in this moment. He was surrounded by others, all dressed in uniform, all seemingly trapped in this moment over and over again. All systems check. Flaps down. I could hear the panic rising in the voices now, an undercurrent of fear that had never been there before. The aircraft was plummeting, fast, too fast. I watched, horrified, as the crew's faces grew pale, their eyes wide with terror. "We're going down," one of the pilots shouted. But there was nothing anyone could do. The cockpit seemed to shudder, the windows cracking under the pressure of something unseen, something pulling them down. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision faded. The cockpit disappeared, leaving only the terminal before me, but the voices remained, quiet now, but still present, like a distant echo. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow, my chest tightening with the weight of what I had just witnessed. I hadn't just seen a memory. I had seen their end. The pilots weren't just stuck in the terminal, they were trapped in their final moments, reliving their deaths over and over again. The curse of this place wasn't just the airport, it was the flight itself, the descent into darkness, the terror of knowing that there was no escape. They were all here, caught in an eternal loop, bound to the runway, unable to break free. My legs felt weak, my mind struggling to grasp the full weight of what I had uncovered. The spirits weren't just wandering the terminal, they were reliving their flights, their crashes, over and over again, a twisted cycle that trapped them in a moment of horror, never allowing them to find peace. I had to get out of here. I had to escape before I became part of their story, part of the endless loop. But as I turned to leave, I realized something. The voices had stopped. The cockpit had vanished. But one thing remained, the soft, steady hum of engines, growing louder once again. And it was coming closer. I tried to pull myself together, to make sense of what had just happened. My pulse was still racing, the vision of the cockpit, the faces of those pilots, burned into my mind. The air was thick with the energy of their trapped souls, each one frozen in that moment of terror. I had thought I understood the curse that had bound them to this place, but now it seemed far worse than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a ghost story, it was a prison, a never-ending nightmare. I turned and hurried toward the staircase, desperate to get back to the main terminal, to escape the oppressive atmosphere of this hidden hallway. But as my foot hit the first step, I felt it again, the pull. It was subtle at first, like the faint tug of a thread in the back of my mind, urging me to go somewhere. But as I ascended, the sensation grew stronger, almost magnetic. The hum of the engines was louder now, more insistent, calling to me, pulling me back down the corridor toward the door I had just opened. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to fight it. I knew I had to leave this place. I'd learned enough. I'd seen enough. But the call of the runway, the promise of something just out of reach, was too powerful to ignore. The door at the end of the terminal, the one that led out to the runway, was like a beacon now, drawing me in as though my feet had a mind of their own. I looked behind me, trying to convince myself to turn back, to leave this cursed airport behind. But my legs moved of their own accord, stepping closer to the door, step by step. I couldn't fight it. I didn't even want to fight it anymore. There was something about this place, this airport, that felt like a home I couldn't leave. As I neared the door, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the captain or one of the other pilots standing in the shadows, watching me with those hollow eyes. But the terminal was empty. The shadows stretched long across the floor, and yet the hum of the engines remained, growing louder with each passing second. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. There was no turning back now. I pulled the door open, and the night air hit me like a slap in the face. The runway stretched out before me, vast and dark, disappearing into the endless horizon. The lights along the sides of the runway flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The tarmac seemed to pulse, as if it was alive, vibrating beneath my feet. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and something else, something metallic, like the remnants of a crash that had never been cleared. I stepped outside, and the world seemed to tilt. The runway felt like it was stretching farther and farther away, like a path that would never end. The noise, that steady hum of engines, was now deafening. I looked up, expecting to see a plane in the distance, but there was nothing. The sky was a solid, impenetrable black, and the stars had been swallowed by the void. I could feel it now, the presence of something watching me. The spirits, the pilots who had never left, they were here. Their eyes were on me, though I couldn't see them. The air around me seemed to thicken with their energy, like I was walking through a dense fog made of memories and regrets. I started walking down the runway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. With each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could almost hear the soft rustle of uniforms, the low murmur of voices, the faintest rustle of paper as flight records shifted in the wind. But there was no one here. Just me and the haunting presence of the past. I reached the middle of the runway, and for the first time, I stopped. I felt the ground beneath me tremble, a low vibration running through the tarmac, as if something was coming. The hum of engines was louder now, closer, almost as if the plane was right behind me, preparing to take off. I turned quickly, expecting to see a shadow in the distance, but the runway remained empty. And yet, the feeling of the plane approaching was undeniable. I felt a rush of panic. What was happening? What was this place trying to do to me? I was no longer sure what was real. The line between the physical world and whatever this cursed airport was had blurred. I wasn't just walking down a runway anymore. I was walking through the remnants of lives lost, of time suspended, of spirits forever trapped in their final moments. The air grew colder again, the icy tendrils of the past curling around me. I glanced up at the sky, but it remained dark and empty. The stars, the planes, the world itself felt as if they had disappeared. There was only the runway, endless and stretching out before me, beckoning me to follow, to keep walking, to never stop. I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the ground, my body frozen in place by an invisible force. I could hear the engines now, growing louder, like a storm approaching. The ground beneath me seemed to shake with the force of the approaching aircraft, its engines roaring to life. I looked down the runway, but there was still no sign of the plane. And then, the first shadow appeared. It was small at first, just a ripple in the darkness, but as it grew, I realized what it was. A figure. A pilot, dressed in full uniform, walking toward me. But he wasn't walking like a man. He was drifting, gliding across the tarmac, his body slightly bent forward, his eyes fixed on something far ahead of him. His movements were mechanical, disconnected from the world around him, as if he were a part of the runway itself. I felt my heart race, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure was getting closer, and the hum of the engines grew louder still, until it was deafening. I could feel the vibrations of the plane, as if it were right behind me, preparing to take off. The figure stopped just a few feet away, and I could feel his presence, the weight of his spirit, pressing on me. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I knew he was one of them. One of the lost pilots, forever walking this path, reliving his final flight. And I realized, with a horrible certainty, that I was standing in his place now. The runway wasn't just a path, it was a prison. A trap. And I was being pulled into it, drawn in by forces beyond my understanding. The hum of the plane reached its peak, and then everything went silent. The figure vanished, fading into the air as if he had never been there. But the runway remained. And I was still standing in the middle of it, no longer sure if I was walking toward escape or becoming just another lost soul, forever bound to the Phantom Airport in Arizona. The air was thick with the vibrations of the unseen plane, its engines roaring louder than ever. My chest tightened, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run away from whatever this cursed place was, run from the spirits, from the hum of the phantom aircraft that seemed to be alive in a way that defied logic. But I couldn't. The magnetic pull of the runway had me, locked in place, my legs moving on their own as if they had a mind of their own. The shadow of the plane had appeared out of nowhere, a dark shape moving silently down the runway. I blinked, unable to make sense of it. There was no plane on the horizon, nothing to explain the roaring noise and the ominous shadow that was now racing towards me. It didn't belong here. I knew that much. And yet, my feet were already moving forward. I tried to fight it. Tried to force myself to stop, to turn around and run back to the safety of the terminal. But the plane, if it could even be called that, was coming for me. Its shadow was stretching out, and I could feel the ground tremble beneath my feet with each passing second. The strange energy in the air thickened, pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. It wasn't just the shadow of the plane. I could see the flicker of lights in the distance, flickering like the remnants of an old aircraft, those flickering lights dancing across the runway. The steady hum of its engines pulsed in my ears like the heartbeat of some ancient beast. I was drawn to it, compelled to chase it, as though I could somehow find an answer by following it. I had to know what it meant. I had to see it up close. My feet hit the tarmac, each step heavier than the last. The shadow grew larger, clearer, as if the plane was manifesting in real time, the engines beginning to roar with an intensity that rattled my bones. I felt the heat from the engines, an intense blast of warm air that should have been impossible at this hour, given the cold that surrounded me. The lights of the runway began to flash faster, as though they were alive, pulsing in sync with the rhythm of the aircraft that was drawing closer and closer. I was almost running now, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart racing. There was something so real about this phantom plane, something that felt like it was pulling me into its orbit. I could see it now, barely discernible in the dark, but I could feel its presence all around me. The ghostly image of the plane appeared to be glitching, its outline shimmering and flickering like an old film reel struggling to maintain focus. The engine noise was deafening, overwhelming my senses. The closer I got, the less it seemed like an aircraft and more like a specter, a shadow of a time long past, stretching into eternity. I felt the heat of the engine, the wind whipping my face, the roar of the plane filling my ears. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't a physical plane at all. The metal body shimmered like a mirage, flickering in and out of view, its edges warping as if it was a phantom trapped between dimensions. I couldn't look away. There was no doubt in my mind now that this was something beyond the physical world, something trapped in the very air itself. The shadow of the plane now seemed to tower over me, almost as if it was hovering just above the ground, its lights flickering sporadically. I could see silhouettes of people in the windows, faces distorted by the flicker of the plane's lights. Some of them were staring directly at me, their expressions frozen, their eyes lifeless. Others were standing, walking down the aisle as if they were on a normal flight. But there was no sound from them, no voices. Just the eerie hum of the engine and the silence of their faces. I was too close now. Too far into this nightmarish vision to stop. My legs moved faster, and I could feel the ground beneath me vibrating, shaking with the intensity of the aircraft that was drawing nearer. I reached out, reaching for the fading shape of the plane, my fingers grazing the edge of its flickering form. And then, without warning, the plane seemed to dissolve, the engines cutting off with an unnatural finality. The air grew still, colder than it had ever been, and the lights of the runway blinked out one by one, as though they had never existed. The runway was empty again. I stopped dead in my tracks, my chest heaving as I tried to process what had just happened. The plane, the phantom plane, was gone. But the sensation lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on me, filling my chest with a cold emptiness that spread through my limbs. The air around me felt thicker now, almost suffocating, like the absence of the plane had left a void in its wake. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, a voice whispered through the night air, faint and distant. "You shouldn't have followed us." The words were barely audible, like a breath caught in the wind. But they were clear enough to send a chill down my spine, to stop me dead in my tracks. The voice was not human. It was layered, as though many voices were speaking at once, each one distorting the other. The temperature around me dropped even further, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I had crossed a line. I had followed the shadows, followed the phantom plane, and now I was a part of it. The runway stretched endlessly in front of me, but I could no longer see the way back. It was like the airport itself had claimed me. "You shouldn't have followed us." The voice repeated, this time louder, the wind carrying the sound across the desolate stretch of tarmac. And just like that, the runway, my only path out, was lost to me. The wind had died down. The deafening hum of the engines was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The eerie sensation of being watched lingered as I stood at the center of the runway, unsure whether to turn back or keep walking into the abyss that had swallowed the phantom plane. My chest was tight, each breath harder to take than the last, but there was something else, a strange pull, a sense of inevitability that tugged me toward the hangar where the aircraft had once been. It was as if the shadows themselves were guiding me. Reluctantly, I began to move again, the steps heavier now as the weight of what I had just experienced pressed down on me. The runway, which had once felt like a path leading me to escape, now felt like a trap. And yet, my legs carried me toward the hangar, drawn by an unseen force. When I reached the entrance, I hesitated. The doors, half open and rusted with age, creaked on their hinges as if responding to my presence. Inside, the air was colder, a chill that sank deeper into my bones. The dim light from the terminal barely reached into the hangar, but I could make out the outline of a large, abandoned aircraft. It stood silent in the gloom, its wings spread wide like a sleeping giant. The faded markings on the tail and body were barely legible, a reminder of the time long past when it had once flown the skies. I stepped inside, my shoes making no sound against the concrete floor. The air was thick with dust, the faint scent of jet fuel still lingering in the corners of the room. But something else, something more subtle, yet far more disturbing, hung in the air. The feeling of being watched. And then, I saw it. The cockpit door, partially ajar. A faint glow from within illuminated the edges of the doorframe, casting long shadows across the floor. There was no reason to be drawn to it, no rational explanation for why I was compelled to enter. Yet, I couldn't resist. My hand reached out on its own, pushing the door open with a groan of metal against metal. The cockpit was dimly lit, the controls and instruments old, covered in dust, but still somehow intact. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the pilot's seat, the leather worn and cracked from years of disuse. But it wasn't empty. There was a figure sitting in the seat. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps a shadow cast by the dim glow of the hangar, but no. There was a man sitting in the cockpit, his hands on the controls, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if waiting for something. His uniform was old-fashioned, faded with age. A pilot's hat rested on his head, the emblem tarnished. His face was pale, almost translucent, as though he were a specter trapped in time. I froze. I knew who he was, the same figure I had seen in the shadow of the plane, the captain, one of the lost souls that had never left. He was no longer just a vague outline in the distance. He was here, in front of me, as real as I was. His presence filled the cockpit, a cold, oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. And then, just as I was about to speak, just as I tried to call out to him, everything changed. The cockpit shimmered, the air thickening with static, and suddenly, I was no longer in the hangar. The scene around me transformed in an instant. The cockpit, once dark and decaying, was now alive with activity. The hum of the engines was back, louder than ever, vibrating through my body. Outside the windows, I saw nothing but blackness, as though the plane was surrounded by an endless night. The pilot's hands gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white. His face, though still pale, was now filled with an expression of intense concentration, a deep sense of foreboding. He glanced at the co-pilot, who sat next to him, but their face was obscured by shadows. I could hear the quiet hum of the radio, a crackling transmission that was barely audible, followed by a voice I couldn't make out. And then, the warning lights flashed. "Altitude, Captain," the co-pilot's voice said, almost a whisper, a tremor of fear in their words. "We're too low. Something's wrong." The captain didn't respond immediately. His fingers twitched, adjusting the controls, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He wasn't in control anymore. Something was pulling the plane down, drawing it toward an inevitable fate. The radio crackled again, this time more urgently. "Mayday! Mayday! This is flight, coming in too fast, can't level, Mayday!" I watched in stunned silence as this scene unfolded before me, helpless to intervene. The captain's face twisted with confusion, then with terror. His hands were shaking as he struggled with the controls, desperately trying to pull the plane back up, but it was no use. The ground below was rising fast. The warning lights continued to blink, a deafening alarm filling the cockpit. "Brace for impact," the captain whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. The cockpit seemed to tremble violently, and then it stopped. The ghostly image of the captain, the plane, the co-pilot, they all vanished in an instant, leaving me alone in the dark cockpit. The sound of the engines was gone. The overwhelming sense of presence, the cold weight of their shared fate, remained. I could feel it pressing in on me. The overwhelming reality of the doomed flight, the crash that had never stopped, the moment of terror that had been frozen in time, had just played out before me. I sat frozen in the pilot's seat, the fading echoes of the flight still swirling around me. The cold grip of the cockpit seemed to linger in my hands, the pressure of the plane's tragic descent still heavy on my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The haunting image of the flight was etched into my mind, clearer than ever. I understood now. This was the fate of the pilots, of all those who had died in the air, trapped forever in the moments before their doomed flight. The plane had never crashed, it was still falling. And the spirits, they would never leave. Neither would I. I turned toward the open door of the cockpit, the darkness of the hangar swallowing everything around me. There was no way out. Not anymore. I had followed the shadows, and now I was part of them. Forever. The air inside the cockpit was suffocating. The weight of the vision I had just witnessed hung heavily in the room, a palpable presence that refused to fade. The plane, the ghostly phantom of its former self, was still with me, its image seared into my mind, its tragic descent playing on a loop behind my eyes. But something had shifted. The stillness in the hangar, the oppressive silence, was no longer comforting. It was heavy with anticipation, as though the next part of the story was about to unfold, whether I was ready for it or not. Suddenly, I felt the air change. A faint sound, like the crackling of static, buzzed in my ears. The world around me shimmered once more, flickering as though the very fabric of reality were beginning to tear apart. I stumbled back, instinctively reaching for something to steady myself, but the cockpit seemed to melt away. The hangar, the controls, the phantom plane, they all vanished. And in their place, I was no longer in the safety of the cockpit. Instead, I was standing in the midst of a storm. The sky above me was thick with swirling clouds, dark and ominous. The wind howled, deafening, tugging at my clothes, making it hard to stand. The horizon was swallowed by the blackness of the storm, and yet there was a strange, unnatural light illuminating the space around me. It wasn't the light of the sun or even the glow of moonlight. It was an eerie, pale radiance, as if the storm had its own twisted source of illumination. Then I saw it. The plane. It was real. It was the same aircraft, its form distorted by the storm and the chaos around it. The body of the plane was shaking, as though it were struggling against the elements, the metal groaning under the pressure of the winds. The wings flickered in and out of view, shimmering like an illusion, struggling to maintain their form in the violent storm. I could hear the engines, the deafening roar as the plane fought against the air, trying to climb, but failing. The plane's nose dipped slightly, its descent becoming inevitable. The control panel inside the cockpit blinked erratically, warning lights flashing furiously as the plane fought its descent. And then, the sound, the horrible, screeching sound of metal twisting, the glass shattering, the engines whining in agony as they sputtered and died. Everything froze. I stood there, paralyzed in the storm, unable to look away as this scene unfolded before me. The cockpit lights blinked one last time before going dark. The last transmission crackled in the air, distorted by the heavy winds, a message from the captain, his voice laced with terror. "Mayday, Mayday! The radio cut out. And then, I saw it. The plane began its final descent, the nose pitching downward at an alarming speed. I could feel the violent tremor in the air, the rush of wind as it plummeted. The wings twisted, buckling under the pressure, and the plane screamed as it tore through the storm. The trees below, once barely visible through the storm's thick veil, now rushed toward the plane at a terrifying speed. The ground was approaching. I felt a sickening knot in my stomach, as though I were being pulled into the crash itself. The plane was going down. There was no way to stop it. I could see the faces of the passengers in the windows, their expressions frozen in terror. Their eyes wide, their mouths agape in silent screams. The moment of impact came in slow motion. The wheels hit the earth with a jarring force, the plane skidding violently, ripping through the ground. There was an explosion of dirt, debris, and fire as the plane tore apart. The noise was deafening, the metal crumpling like paper, the flames rising in a horrific blaze that consumed everything in its path. The ground trembled under the impact, the fire burning so intensely it seemed to warp the very air around it. I could hear the screams now, loud, distorted, and impossible to escape. The haunting sounds of the crash reverberated around me, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of chaos. The screams of the passengers, the desperate cries of the crew, it was all too real, too vivid. And yet, it was all just a vision. Or was it? As the fire began to die down, the vision of the crash still lingered in the air, a haunting echo of the past that wouldn't release me. I could feel the heat of the flames on my skin, the smoke filling my lungs, the sound of metal tearing, of lives lost, all still pressing against me, suffocating me. But the worst part, what I couldn't shake, was the eerie silence that followed. I stood amidst the wreckage, alone. The flames had died down, and the storm had passed, leaving only the charred remnants of the crash behind. There was no sound, no movement, only the distant rumble of thunder as the storm moved on. The once thriving airport was now a desolate graveyard, its history lay bare before me. And there, standing in the wreckage, I saw them. The shadows. They were emerging from the broken plane, stepping out of the wreckage, their figures blurred by the lingering heat of the flames. The spirits, the souls of the passengers and crew, were walking through the ruins of their final moments, reliving their crash over and over again. They were stuck in this loop, trapped forever in the crash, unable to move on. I could feel them, their eyes searching me out, their hands reaching for me, as though they wanted me to join them. Their faces were twisted with grief, with rage, with fear, each one of them condemned to the same fate. Suddenly, the vision around me started to distort, the air thickening with the weight of their emotions, the tragedy, the horror. I tried to move, to step away, but my legs were frozen, as though the ground beneath me was no longer solid. The shadows closed in, their eyes fixed on me, their whispers filling the air, growing louder and more desperate with every passing second. Then, the captain's voice, soft but unmistakable, reached me through the chaos. "Get out," he whispered, his voice breaking through the overwhelming noise. "Get out before it's too late." And just like that, the world around me dissolved into darkness. I was alone again. The crash, the spirits, the flames, all gone. The only sound left was my ragged breathing, the harsh pulse of my heart, and the lingering feeling that I had witnessed something far worse than just an accident. It was a tragedy that would never end, a fate I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. The spirits of the lost flight were trapped, reliving the crash over and over again, and now, so was I. My mind reeled, the vision of the crash still vivid in my senses. The air around me seemed to shift, thickening with an oppressive weight that threatened to choke me. I could still hear the whispers of the dead, their voices interwoven with the howl of the storm, each word a pull, drawing me back into the nightmare I had just escaped. The captain's warning echoed in my mind. Get out before it's too late. But where? Where could I go? Every direction seemed to lead me back to the wreckage, to the storm, to the endless loop of the crash. The more I tried to escape, the more the world around me twisted, folding in on itself like a shattered mirror. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my mind, trying to hold on to the reality I had known just moments before. The hangar, where was it? I had to get out. I had to leave. But every step I took felt heavier, as though the ground beneath me was no longer solid, as though it were sinking, pulling me deeper into the chaos of this phantom world. Calm down, focus, I told myself, trying to steady my breath. You're not really here. This is not real. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less certain I became. The storm raged around me, the dark sky pressing down with an unnatural force, and the air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers continued, now rising to a crescendo, the voices of the lost souls calling to me, their grief, their pain, their terror all mixing into one deafening roar. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against the remains of the plane, the heat from the wreckage still radiating in the air. The metal beneath my fingers was cold and yet searing hot at the same time. I jerked my hand away, but it left behind a faint, glowing residue on my skin, a symbol, an imprint from this place. My heart began to race, a terror deep inside me taking hold. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. I turned in a circle, desperate to find something solid, something familiar that would remind me of the real world. But everything around me was warped, distorted by the storm and the vision, the faces of the dead closing in, their eyes locked on mine, their mouths open in silent pleas. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape this place. I started running. My footsteps echoed hollowly in the storm, my breath coming in frantic bursts as I sprinted toward what I thought was an exit, a distant doorway that had appeared in the midst of the chaos. But as I neared it, the doorway seemed to stretch farther away. No matter how fast I ran, it only grew more distant, like an illusion. My chest tightened, and panic surged through me. Then, a figure appeared in the doorway, a shadow, tall and indistinct, but unmistakably there. It stepped forward, and as it did, the storm seemed to ease, the wind slowing, the deafening roar of the crash dimming. It was the pilot, the one from the cockpit, the captain. His face was pale, his expression empty, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes as he stared at me. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, a million thoughts rushing through my mind. Was this another illusion? Or was he the key to escaping this nightmare? You're still here, he whispered, his voice distorted by the wind. You have to leave. Now. His voice seemed to cut through the chaos, like a lifeline thrown into the storm. I took a step forward, unsure whether I should trust him, unsure whether this was real. But the more I looked at him, the more I saw his desperation, the pleading in his eyes. He wasn't here to hurt me. He was trying to help. The storm intensified again, the darkness growing deeper. I looked over my shoulder, but the wreckage, the shadows of the lost souls, were closing in on me again. The plane was still there, its twisted metal glinting in the storm's eerie light, the screams of the dead once more rising in the air. Without thinking, I ran toward the figure, ignoring the voices that called my name, ignoring the pull of the wreckage. The captain's figure faded as I neared him, and the storm seemed to follow his movement, swirling around me with every step I took. But I wasn't sure what was real anymore, his presence or the space I was rushing through. Suddenly, my feet slipped. I stumbled, catching myself against the invisible force pushing against me. I reached out desperately, my hand stretching toward the captain's fading figure. I was so close, I could feel it, feel the escape just within reach. But then, something tugged at me, pulling me backward. I felt my body jerk as though something had grabbed hold of me, dragging me back into the storm. No, no, and no! I screamed in frustration, twisting my body to free myself. The force, whatever it was, grew stronger, pulling me deeper into the darkness, into the crash I could no longer escape. Then, in that instant of despair, I saw something, a flicker in the air. A crack, a break in the illusion. The vision faltered, and with a desperate, final effort, I closed my eyes and willed myself to wake. I could still feel the storm, the chill of the phantom airport, but I fought it. I focused on the real world, on the solid ground beneath my feet, on the knowledge that I wasn't truly in the midst of the crash anymore. The moment stretched. And then, everything went silent. The storm, the voices, the shadows, gone. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath. I was back. I stood in the abandoned terminal of the airport, the dust settling in the air. The darkness had lifted. The storm had vanished. The only sound was the faint hum of the distant wind outside the terminal windows. My pulse raced, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. My mind spun in confusion. Had it all been a hallucination? A vision? Or had I truly crossed into something otherworldly? But as I looked around, the familiar shape of the terminal greeted me. It was no longer alive with supernatural energy. It was just an old, abandoned airport, quiet, empty. For a moment, I thought I had escaped. But deep down, I knew the spirits of the lost flight were still here, lingering, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I was truly free, or if the illusion had only just begun. The silence after the storm was deafening. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, feeling the weight of the nightmare lift. But it was a false relief. Something deep within me told me that it wasn't over. I had escaped one illusion, but the airport, this cursed place, still held me in its grip. I walked through the terminal, the faint hum of air conditioning the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. The place seemed normal, if normal could ever be used to describe such a place. The broken windows let in slivers of moonlight, casting ghostly shadows over the dust-covered floors. I tried to shake off the last remnants of the vision, focusing instead on the reality around me. It's just an old airport, I told myself. Nothing more. But then, I heard it. A soft creak, faint at first, like a door slowly opening. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It was coming from the far end of the terminal, where the darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. My heart began to race again, the feeling of dread returning. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the empty terminal, a low, raspy whisper that sent chills crawling up my spine. Leave, now, before it's too late. The words were clear, though the voice sounded distant, as if it came from a place I couldn't quite reach. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But another part of me, the part that had experienced the crash vision, knew better. This wasn't just a warning. It was a desperate plea. I glanced around, half expecting the captain or another ghostly figure to appear, but the terminal was empty. just the remnants of a once thriving place, now abandoned and decaying. Yet the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. I knew I should leave. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn around and walk out. I had been given a warning. The ghosts of the airport were trying to tell me something. But the pull of the mystery, the need to understand what had happened here, was too strong. I couldn't leave without uncovering the truth. The past, the spirits, were waiting for me. I couldn't walk away now. So I stayed. I made my way deeper into the terminal, the whispers still echoing in the background, but now fainter, as though the spirits were losing their patience. The further I walked, the more intense the atmosphere became. It felt as though the walls themselves were watching me, pressing in closer, urging me to go. Then, just as I reached the old check-in counter, the temperature dropped. A cold, unnatural chill seeped into my bones, causing me to shiver uncontrollably. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I rubbed my arms to ward off the freezing air. The cold was so sharp it felt like it was cutting through me. It was then that I heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable, footsteps. Soft and slow, as if someone, or something, was moving through the terminal just behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The terminal remained empty, silent, save for the hollow sound of my own breath. But the footsteps continued, louder now, as if approaching me. I felt my skin crawl, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger with each passing second. It wasn't just my imagination, something was moving in the dark, and it wasn't friendly. I turned again, this time backing away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were growing louder, the words becoming more frantic, desperate. Leave. It's coming for you. But I couldn't turn back now. I had made my decision, and there was no going back. The warning had been clear, but the need to know, to understand, was more powerful than my fear. The footsteps grew closer, and I could almost feel the presence behind me, watching, waiting. And then, with a suddenness that left me breathless, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my own breath in the air, thick and clouded. The whispering voices crescendoed into a frantic, unintelligible chant. Something was happening, something terrible. I turned quickly, half expecting to see the shadows of the lost pilots, or perhaps the phantom plane. But instead, what I saw froze me in place. The air in front of me shimmered, and slowly, a figure began to materialize. It was the pilot, the same one I had seen earlier. His form was translucent, shifting in and out of existence, as though he were caught between worlds. His eyes were wide with fear, his mouth moving, but no sound came out. His outstretched hands seemed to beckon me forward, but the terror in his expression told me that whatever he wanted, it wasn't good. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The pilot's form flickered again, and with that flicker, the terminal around me seemed to shift. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the shadows darkening even more, as though the building itself were alive, feeding off the energy of the spirits trapped within it. I should have left. I should have listened. The realization hit me too late. The decision to stay had only intensified the paranormal activity. It wasn't just the spirits of the lost passengers now, something darker had awoken, something much more malevolent. And I had no idea how to escape. The pilot's ghost slowly turned toward the shadowy depths of the terminal, his figure now fading into nothingness, as though beckoning me to follow him into whatever nightmare awaited. With my heart pounding and every instinct screaming at me to run, I took one last look around the terminal. The spirits, no longer silent, began to manifest more vividly. Shadows moved like living things. The whispers turned to shrill screams, the temperature plummeting once more. And in that moment, I realized the terrifying truth. I was no longer just a visitor in this place. I was part of it now. The airport had claimed me, and there was no turning back. The terminal seemed to warp around me, its walls undulating like the surface of a disturbed lake. Every corner I turned felt familiar yet foreign, as though the airport was no longer the place I had entered but some twisted version of it, held together by threads that were slowly unraveling. The chill in the air had thickened again, seeping deeper into my skin, making every movement feel heavy, as if I were wading through an invisible storm. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. But every time I closed my eyes, the darkness that took hold of me felt wrong. The moment I opened them again, the air seemed denser, the shadows darker. They crept closer, pressing in around me, and for a brief moment, I couldn't tell if I was still in the terminal or if I had crossed over entirely into whatever nightmare this place had become. The whispers were back, their voices soft at first but growing more insistent with each passing second. They weren't just echoes anymore, they were thoughts, invading my mind, filling it with confusion. Every word seemed like a riddle, a warning, a demand. Some of them came from the spirits, others felt like they were coming from within me, as if my own thoughts were being manipulated, twisted into something I didn't recognize. Leave. Leave now. It's too late for you. You're not here. This is not real. I staggered backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The world seemed to shift beneath me, like standing on shifting sands. The terminal was still there, but it was slipping through my fingers. I could feel it, the way the real world was fading, dissolving into the unseen. My grip on reality was slipping, like trying to hold on to a dream that was slipping away the moment I tried to focus on it. No, I'm not losing it. This is real. This has to be real. I repeated the words over and over, like a mantra, trying to cling to the tangible things, the creaky floorboards, the rusted metal of the terminal's once glimmering walls. But the harder I focused on them, the more they distorted, twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. Every surface seemed to shimmer with a strange, unnatural light, as if the very essence of the place was becoming untethered from any known rules of physics or reality. You're not real. You never were. The thought whispered inside my mind, and I recoiled, feeling a cold shiver race down my spine. Was I still myself? Was I still here? Or had I slipped away, just a figment of something, an echo of a person who no longer existed? The terminal grew quieter, but the weight of the silence pressed down on me, suffocating. My body felt light, detached, as if my mind was floating above it, looking down at the person I used to be. I could no longer tell if the sensation was dread or numbness, but it was consuming me, swallowing my sense of self. Then the air changed, thickening, the whispers fading into a low hum, a sound that vibrated within me, deep and unsettling. It was like a plane's engines revving up in the distance, but there was no plane, no real sound. It was just there, vibrating through my bones. The hum swelled, and for a moment, I felt as though I were no longer standing on solid ground. I stumbled toward the nearest wall, trying to steady myself, but my fingers met nothing but air. The terminal had dissolved into an endless void, stretching out before me like a blackened abyss. I gasped, reaching out in the empty space, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. My heart raced in panic, the ground slipping further from beneath me as the world around me twisted. Am I dying? The thought struck me, and I froze. My chest tightened as I struggled to breathe, the air growing heavy and thick in my lungs. The more I tried to hold on to my sense of reality, the further it stretched away from me, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. The shadows around me grew darker, coiling like living things, pulling at me, tugging me into the void. The terminal reappeared in flashes, snippets of it, just as I thought I had lost it forever. The walls blinked in and out of existence, the windows shifting between cracked and whole. And then, just as I thought I might finally wake from this nightmare, I saw something that froze my blood. A figure. Not the captain this time, but someone else. A shadowed form, barely visible, standing in the middle of the terminal. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me, like a twisted version of me, my eyes wide with terror, staring back at me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its gaze locked on mine. I gasped, stumbling backward, the realization hitting me like a blow. This wasn't just a place haunted by spirits. This was a place where the very fabric of reality was torn. And I wasn't just losing my grip on the world around me. I was losing myself. The figure in the terminal began to flicker like a malfunctioning television. One moment, it was there, standing still, and the next, it was gone, only to reappear in a different part of the terminal, closer this time. It wasn't an illusion. I was being pulled into it, being reflected back at myself, trapped in a loop, an endless repetition of my own fears. I reached out, but my hand passed through the air as if it didn't belong in this space. And then, everything around me started to fade, and I felt myself being drawn towards the figure. Toward the fractured reflection of myself that stared back at me, its eyes hollow, its face twisted in something darker. The ground disappeared beneath my feet, and I fell deeper into the darkness, into the nothingness. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. The void consumed me, and all I could hear was the deafening hum of the unseen plane's engines, louder now, closer, until it was all that was left. And then, nothing. I awoke with a start, gasping for air as if I had been submerged in water. My lungs burned with the desperate need for oxygen, but there was no air. No breath. No world around me to ground me. I blinked in confusion, the cold, suffocating darkness pressing in on all sides, heavy and all-encompassing. But then the hum returned, faint at first, like the low rumble of an engine starting up in the distance. I could feel it deep in my chest, as though the very vibrations of it were coursing through me, pulling me towards something. Something else. I tried to move, but my body felt detached, as if I were floating above it. I could see my own hands, transparent and insubstantial, reaching out into the void, but I couldn't touch anything. The shadows around me swirled like a thick mist, and I could hear the whispering voices again, growing louder. It was as if the air itself had become alive, twisting and bending, pushing me forward. Come to us. The voices were clear now, clearer than before, their tones soft yet commanding. They were calling to me, beckoning me closer with a seductive pull. At first, I resisted. I wanted to fight it, to cling to whatever shred of reality I still had. But the pressure from the spirits around me was relentless, each whisper curling around me like invisible hands, urging me forward. I had no choice but to move. My feet followed the pull as though they were no longer my own, stepping toward the source of the hum, toward the shape slowly materializing out of the darkness ahead. A plane. A phantom plane. It appeared like a vision, glowing faintly with an eerie light, a spectral silhouette against the empty void. The fuselage shimmered, translucent yet solid, like a relic of another time, a piece of a forgotten world that refused to fade. I could see the windows, dimly illuminated, but no passengers, no crew. The aircraft hung in midair, suspended in an eternal stasis, as though it had been waiting for me all along. I felt the temperature drop even further, the chill seeping deep into my bones. But it wasn't the cold of the void, it was the cold of death, the cold of things lost to time. My heart raced as I realized the truth. This plane wasn't a machine. It was a trap. And somehow, I had been lured into it. The whispering voices intensified, now surrounding me, no longer coming from a distance. They were inside me, pressing on my mind, making me want to get closer. The image of the plane grew sharper as I approached. I could almost hear the faint sound of engines starting, the hum growing louder, as if they were trying to coax me aboard. I stepped forward, but I had no real control over my body. I wasn't sure whether my legs were moving of their own accord, or if my mind had given in entirely to the lure of the spirits. The closer I got, the more the world around me seemed to blur, fading out of focus, as though reality itself was abandoning me in favor of this apparition. I reached the plane, my hand extending automatically, and it passed right through the gleaming surface of the aircraft. But as I touched it, I felt an overwhelming force. A shock of cold electricity surged through my arm, up into my chest, and for a moment, I felt like I was being pulled into the plane, no longer walking but drifting, waveless, drawn in by the invisible hands of the spirits. The door to the plane opened with a low creak, and I found myself stepping inside. The interior was empty but for the lingering presence of the past. The seats were old and worn, faded fabrics with threads hanging loose. Everything was frozen in time, yet the air within the plane felt strangely alive, thick with the energy of the spirits who had boarded before me. Their presence pressed against me, cold and suffocating. I didn't need to look to know that I wasn't alone. The plane, though deserted, was filled with them. The ghosts of the pilots, the lost souls of passengers, all of them trapped in their final moments, doomed to relive the horrors of their last flight again and again. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the hum of the engines, now vibrating through the very fabric of the plane. The walls of the aircraft groaned, and I could feel its weight, its gravity, pulling me deeper into its embrace. The spirits were all around me, their presence pressing on every side, drowning me in their cold, oppressive force. But there was something else. I could feel the pull of the cockpit ahead, the final destination. It was not just a plane that was calling to me now. It was the spirits themselves, urging me to join them, to become one with them. They whispered of the crash, of the doomed flight that had taken place long ago, of the lost souls forever bound to the sky. And as the door to the cockpit opened, I knew what I had to do. I stepped forward, not as a passenger, but as another soul waiting for its last flight. The voices of the spirits crescendoed in my mind, the hum of the engines deafening, urging me on. There was no escaping it now. I was part of the plane, part of the curse. The cockpit was dim, the instruments dead and unlit, yet the air was thick with the scent of fuel and burned metal. I could almost hear the crackling of the radio, the static building in waves as though the plane was about to take off into the unknown. The seatbelt light flickered on, the last warning before the flight began. The plane started to shake, and I felt myself drawn to the seat in front of me. There was no use in resisting now. I was already a passenger on this final flight, this ghostly, eternal journey through the skies. As the plane's engines roared to life, I heard one final whisper in my ear. The spirits weren't just beckoning me to fly. They were telling me that this flight would never end. The air inside the cockpit felt thick, almost suffocating, as the engines of the spectral plane roared to life, vibrating through every inch of my body. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The whispering voices, now loud enough to fill the entire plane, surrounded me, swirling in my ears, becoming one voice, one unified command. Join us. It wasn't a question. It was an offer, no, a demand. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. My heart raced, faster and faster, as if the spirits were somehow syncing with my pulse, matching their rhythm to mine. The cockpit light flickered as if in warning, but it did little to diminish the pull of the voices that were already wrapping themselves around my mind, pulling me deeper into the abyss that was this cursed flight. I glanced out of the small window, but instead of the familiar night sky, all I saw was a swirling vortex of shadows, a thick fog that obscured any view beyond. I was trapped in this plane, in this moment, a place that didn't exist in the real world. The spirit's whispers grew louder, clearer. The words didn't come from any one direction, they echoed in my mind, in my very soul, as if they were all inside me. You have a choice. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my mind spinning. The cockpit was now bathed in an eerie blue light, the faintest glow emanating from the instruments in front of me. I could hear the low hum of the engines beneath me, the gentle but insistent vibration. Join us and never leave. Never die. Become part of the sky. The weight of the offer settled over me. The choice. Was this what they had been preparing me for all along? The ghosts, the plane, the terminal, all of it. They had brought me here, lured me into this place of darkness and shadows. And now they wanted me to become like them, to be one with them. I could feel the pull, deep within me, a yearning, almost a longing. It wasn't just the spirit's voices that urged me forward. It was the very essence of the plane, the curse that had bound it, the inescapable lure of death and the afterlife. The spirits weren't offering me a way out. They weren't offering peace. They were offering immortality, the promise of being forever lost in the endless skies, bound to the plane in a never-ending flight. But at what cost? It's not so bad, a voice whispered in my ear, and I turned toward it, startled. A figure stood just behind me, a pilot, translucent and flickering like a broken hologram. His face was hollow, his eyes empty voids, yet I could sense a kind of peace in his presence. A resignation to the curse. You will never age. You will never feel pain. You will never be alone. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body refused. The words, though twisted and eerie, had a strange allure, a promise of safety and comfort. A part of me, deep inside, wanted to accept. The thought of living forever in this endless loop, free from the pain of the real world, was tempting. But then, the flickering figure leaned closer, his cold breath brushing my ear, sending a chill through my spine. But you will never feel alive again. The words were like ice, freezing the desire that had been growing inside me. There was no warmth in their promise. No real life. Just an eternity of repeating the same moment, the same flight, the same endless journey through the dark skies. Was that worth it? Was being trapped in this nightmare, being a ghost, bound to a plane that would never land, really what I wanted? A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, as if the spirits were sensing my hesitation. The hum of the engines grew louder, shaking the walls of the plane. Join us. The words were now more desperate, more urgent. I could feel the pull intensify, wrapping around me like a noose, tighter and tighter, as though the very fabric of the plane itself wanted to consume me. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just being offered immortality. I was being offered oblivion. If I joined them, I would never see the world again. I would never feel the warmth of the sun, the cool breeze, the simple joy of breathing in fresh air. I would be a prisoner of the plane, a lost soul forever circling the skies with no purpose, no meaning, just endless repetition of the same doomed flight. The spirits weren't offering peace. They were offering an eternity of stagnation. Leave now, and you will live. The voice that spoke this time wasn't one of the spirits. It wasn't the hum of the engines or the calls of the lost souls. It was my own voice, my own thoughts. But it was clear, it was strong, and it was a warning. I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength I had left. The choice had never been clearer. My body trembled, my mind swirling with doubts and fears, but there was only one thing I could do. I stepped back from the cockpit, away from the figure who had been waiting for me. I turned my back on the plane, on the spirits, on their endless flight. No more. The hum of the engines seemed to roar in frustration as I stumbled toward the door, the plane shaking beneath me, but I didn't stop. I ran, or at least I tried to, my feet moving quickly in the empty space, pulling me away from the phantom plane and its ghostly passengers. But as I reached the door, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, pulling me back. "You can never leave," the voice growled, its tone dripping with anger. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The door opened, and the light of the terminal flooded in, the world of shadows and whispers fading away. But I could still hear them, their voices following me as I stepped out into the emptiness, the pull of the plane still tugging at my soul. "You will never escape," they whispered, fading into nothing. But I didn't listen. I had made my choice. The cold hand gripping my shoulder burned like ice, its touch both heavy and suffocating, pulling me back toward the phantom plane. The spirits' whispers filled the air around me, rising into a deafening chorus of frustration, their voices thick with anger. "You can't run from us." I twisted in a desperate attempt to break free, but the grip was unyielding, its strength far beyond anything human. Panic surged through me, flooding my veins with adrenaline. I had made my choice. I couldn't go back now. I couldn't let the plane pull me back into that never-ending cycle of death. I swung my free arm wildly, my fist connecting with nothing but empty air. The weight of the spirits pressing on me was like being submerged in water, each whisper, each touch, dragging me deeper into the darkness. The air around me thickened, suffocating, and the eerie hum of the engines grew louder, vibrating through my chest like an approaching storm. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It felt like the very essence of the airport, the ghosts and the spirits, was trying to pull me back, to draw me into their world of eternal flight. The fear clawed at my mind, desperate to take hold of me, to crush me under the weight of this ghostly realm. But there was something inside me, a sliver of defiance, that refused to be consumed. I fought back. With every ounce of all I had left, I tore myself away from the cold grasp, stumbling backward. My feet slid on the dusty, forgotten floor of the terminal as I pushed myself further from the phantom plane. The shadows around me writhed, twisting and contorting, reaching out with invisible hands, but I wouldn't let them have me. Not now. Not ever. I turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they had in what felt like forever, but the darkness seemed to stretch out endlessly, the terminal going on, an impossible maze that refused to end. I didn't dare look back. I could feel the weight of the spirits behind me, their presence thick in the air, their voices echoing in my mind, urging me to stop. They were relentless, never giving up, always there, clawing at me with their whispers and their cold touch. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. The door to the terminal loomed ahead, the faint light from the outside world flickering through the crack, offering the only escape. With every step, the shadows seemed to reach for me, but I was close, so close to the light, to freedom. "Don't run." The voice, one of the spirits, now seemed to echo from all directions, surrounding me, suffocating me. But it wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a presence, a force that pressed against me, trying to push me back toward the plane. I reached the door. The exit was within my grasp. But as I grabbed the handle, a rush of cold air slammed into me, sending a violent shiver through my body. The door didn't budge. It was locked. No. I pulled harder, my breath ragged, heart pounding in my chest as I pulled and yanked on the handle, my fingers slipping from the cold metal. The door refused to open, as if it was part of the curse itself, refusing to let me leave. And then I felt it, an unmistakable sensation of weightlessness, as if the ground beneath me had vanished. The terminal faded from view, and the sound of the plane's engines roared back into my ears. The shadows around me shifted, distorting, twisting. I was falling, not physically, but spiritually, being sucked into the very fabric of the ghostly world. "You cannot escape." The voice whispered directly into my ear, cold and unyielding. I felt the spirits surrounding me, their presence like a crushing wave, pushing me toward the phantom plane that I had tried so hard to escape. "You are ours now. Forever." Panic surged once more, a primal fear that threatened to overwhelm me, but I wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and focused on the one thing that had gotten me this far, my will to survive. The fear was real, but it wasn't the fear of the spirits I had to fight, it was the fear inside myself. The fear of being lost forever, of losing my humanity, of becoming just another soul trapped in the endless flight. With every ounce of strength, I shoved the fear aside, willing my mind to stay focused. I opened my eyes and took one final step toward the door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the handle, feeling the cold metal bite into my skin, and I pulled with everything I had. The door burst open. Light flooded in, blinding, overwhelming, and for the briefest moment, I thought I had broken through. I staggered into the light, but then, the ground disappeared from beneath me. I fell, not onto the cold concrete of the terminal floor, but into the depths of the sky, tumbling, spiraling down into nothingness. The ghosts were gone. The airport was gone. The terminal was gone. I wasn't sure if I was still alive or if I had already crossed over, but in that instant, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't in control anymore. The only thing left was the fall. And then, I hit the ground. But it wasn't the ground I expected. It wasn't solid, and it wasn't real. It was just another part of the nightmare. I opened my eyes, heart hammering, breath coming in shallow gasps. But this time, there was no escape. No door. No plane. Only the empty, endless sky, and the faintest whisper of the spirits in the wind. "Welcome aboard." I lay on the cold ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling from the overwhelming ordeal I had just endured. The relentless pull of the spirits, the suffocating darkness, the eerie whispers, they all seemed to have vanished in an instant. The air was still, almost eerily calm, and the chilling weight that had once pressed down on me was gone. As I pushed myself to sit up, I noticed something that filled me with both relief and an unfathomable dread. The sky was no longer swirling with darkness and fog. It was slowly brightening, the first pale rays of dawn cutting through the thick atmosphere like a blade. The spirits that had surrounded me, their cold hands gripping at my very soul, had faded with the night. The plane, the terminal, the ghosts, everything was gone, as if they had never existed at all. But I knew better. I could feel it in my bones, the coldness in the air, the absence of everything that had made the airport feel real. The spirits were still there, somewhere, lingering just beyond the veil of reality. They hadn't vanished, they had merely retreated. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, and looked around. The desolate runway stretched out before me, empty and silent. The old terminal loomed in the distance, abandoned, yet there was a strange sense of finality in the air. As if the airport, this forsaken place, had released its grip on me. But had it truly let me go? I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing on the cracked concrete, the silence pressing against my ears. The light of the morning sun was no comfort. It felt wrong, somehow, too bright, too clear, as though the world had shifted out of place. I glanced back at the runway, my heart heavy with the memory of everything I had witnessed, the ghostly pilots, the echoes of doomed flights, the sense of being trapped in a never-ending loop of death and despair. "You're free now." The voice came from nowhere, and yet it filled the air around me. It wasn't one of the spirits I had encountered, nor was it the faint whisper of the wind. It was a calm, serene voice that carried with it a strange sense of finality. A whisper of peace. "You survived. But you are not the same." I didn't have to look around to know where the voice was coming from. I had heard it before, in the shadows, in the depths of the cockpit. It was the voice of the spirits, of the lost souls who had once flown these skies, who had died on that cursed runway, and who had tried to pull me into their eternal flight. But now, there was no anger in their words. No fear. Only an eerie calm. "We will be here forever, but you," the voice faltered, as if it was struggling to finish. "You will live. You will walk away from this place. But you will never forget." A shiver ran down my spine. The realization hit me like a freight train. They weren't just warning me. They were marking me. I wasn't just a witness to their tragedy. I was part of it now. I had walked the cursed grounds of their airport, seen their final flights, and felt their grasp on my soul. I had made it out, yes, but the ghosts had left a piece of themselves behind in me. I would never be the same. I would never forget the terror I had felt, the souls I had encountered, and the eerie feeling that something, somewhere, would always be waiting for me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. The light of the sun was fully breaking now, casting long shadows across the runway, but even as the day began, the memories of the night would never leave me. I looked one last time at the empty terminal, the place where the spirits had once whispered, where the planes had crashed, and where the ghosts had lingered. It was still there, standing in the distance like a monument to the forgotten, the lost, the dead. As I turned to leave, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest of whispers. "You will never escape us." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The ghosts had faded, but their presence, their curse, would follow me forever. And as the dawn light bathed the desolate runway in an unearthly glow, I knew deep in my bones, the airport, the spirits, the fear, I had left it all behind. But it would never leave me. The last flight had taken place, and I had survived. But the cost was something I would carry with me, a constant reminder of the night the spirits of Phantom Airport tried to take my soul. As I walked away, the ground beneath my feet felt different. I couldn't explain it, but it wasn't solid. not in the way it used to be. The airport was gone. The spirits were gone. But I knew, no matter where I went, I would never be truly free. And somewhere, in the depths of the sky, the phantom planes would keep flying, and the lost pilots would keep waiting. Forever. The light of the new day did little to ease the weight in my chest. The sun, now fully risen, cast an almost unnatural glow over the desolate airport. The once ominous terminal stood like a monument to a bygone era, its crumbling walls telling the stories of lives lost, dreams shattered, and souls forever trapped in an endless loop. I knew that leaving would not be as simple as walking away. Something deep inside me told me I could never truly escape. I had made it out of the terminal. I had made it out of the grip of the spirits, out of their ethereal prison. But the truth was that the shadows of the past clung to me, wrapping themselves around me like an invisible chain. With every step I took away from the airport, the ground beneath my feet felt less real, as if the very earth was unsure of my presence. The familiar weight of the world seemed to press down harder, as if the universe was aware of the unnaturalness of my survival. I stumbled through the ruins of the parking lot, my eyes fixed on the distant road. The car, abandoned just a few hours ago, sat there, waiting. I barely registered the sight of it, my mind too consumed with the images from the night. The plane crashing, the pilots walking through the terminal, the cold hands that had pulled at me from the darkness. My heart raced, the pounding in my chest a constant reminder that I had been in the presence of something far beyond human comprehension. My hand shook as I reached for the car door handle, and it took a few moments before I could steady myself enough to unlock it. The engine roared to life, the sound a sharp contrast to the eerie silence that had hung over the airport for so long. As I pulled away, leaving the grounds behind, I dared not look in the rearview mirror. It was over. It had to be. But even as I drove, the weight of what I had experienced gnawed at me. The quiet hum of the engine seemed to fade in and out, like a broken radio station struggling to find a signal. The landscape around me, the road I knew so well, suddenly felt foreign. I had left the airport behind, yes, but the memories, the shadows, they followed me. Every corner of the rearview mirror was a reminder. Every passing cloud seemed to form shapes, faces, figures of the pilots I had seen walking into the darkness. And every now and then, the faintest whisper would float on the wind, just loud enough to make me question my sanity. I told myself it was over. I told myself I was safe. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Not really. As I drove through the dusty, empty roads of Arizona, I tried to reason with myself, tried to force logic into my spinning thoughts. It was just a place. It was just a ghost story, right? A forgotten terminal, a haunted airport. The spirits had been trapped, yes, but they were gone now. Gone with the night. Yet, the further I drove, the more I realized that I wasn't free. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. That strange, unsettling feeling that something was watching me, something was waiting. And then I heard it. The faintest hum. It was like the engines of an aircraft, distant, growing louder with every passing second. I glanced nervously into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a plane hurtling toward me, but all I saw was the empty road stretching out behind me. The hum grew louder, insistent. It was a sound I knew too well. I looked to the sky, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something. A dark shape, moving far above, cutting through the thin clouds. I blinked, and it was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I knew it wasn't real. I knew I had to be imagining things. But something inside me, something deep and primal, told me that I wasn't. I wasn't free. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The road ahead was endless, stretching out into the unknown. The world outside looked the same, yet it felt different, haunted. And as I looked again into the rearview mirror, I saw it again, a flicker of movement, a shadow, something dark and ghostly in the distance. I slammed my foot on the brake, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. The road was empty. But the hum of the engine, the distant noise, wouldn't stop. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but it felt like something was pulling at me, tugging on my very soul. The spirits, those lost souls who had haunted the airport, who had tried to take me with them, had never truly let me go. They were still there, out there in the world, waiting, watching. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. I couldn't think about it. I couldn't let them pull me back. The world was real, the world was here, and I had to keep moving. But as the wind howled and the sound of the phantom engines seemed to grow louder, I understood one thing. I had left the airport, but it hadn't left me. Not yet. I thought that once I left the airport, I would be free. I thought the nightmares would fade with the miles, that the cold presence that had stalked me through the terminal would stay behind, locked in the darkness of that forsaken place. But as I drove home, the chill that had crept into my bones remained, lingering like a shadow in the corner of my mind. The car ride had been long, the desert landscape stretching on without end. I tried to distract myself with the road, with the familiar sight of the trees and mountains, but nothing felt right. The warmth of the Arizona sun, so comforting and familiar, couldn't penetrate the icy coldness I felt deep inside. When I finally reached my apartment, I was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. I staggered inside, the exhaustion making my limbs heavy. The familiar scent of home should have been a relief, but all I could smell was the sharp, sterile coldness that seemed to cling to the air. I closed the door behind me, locking it with a feeling of finality. But as I stood in the silence of my apartment, something felt wrong. It was the temperature. The room, though it was the same as I had left it, felt unusually cold. I could see my breath fogging the air in front of me, a mist that should not have been there. The heater hadn't been on, and it wasn't winter, yet the chill was so deep that it felt as though the very walls were frozen. My skin prickled, and I shivered uncontrollably. I rubbed my arms, trying to warm myself, but the cold was relentless. The air seemed to have thickened, like the kind of cold you feel in the deep winter when the wind cuts through everything and your very bones ache with the bite of the chill. But there was no reason for it. There was no explanation. The windows were shut, and the heat was still off. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything was still. Then I heard it. A faint, whispering sound, like wind moving through the cracks in the walls. But the air was still. There was no wind, no breeze. Was it the spirits? I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. It was ridiculous. There was no way they could follow me home. No way that place, that cursed airport, could reach me here. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The cold intensified as I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps muffled on the cold floor. I reached for the light switch, but when I flicked it on, the light flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. My breath quickened as I took in the sight of the kitchen, everything in its place, yet feeling off. I stepped back, the cold seeping deeper into my skin. Something wasn't right. The temperature had dropped further, and the air was thick, as though the very atmosphere in the room had become heavier. A gust of cold wind slammed into the side of my face, and I froze, eyes wide, panic rushing through me. I hadn't felt any wind coming through the window. There was no draft. The gust had come from nowhere. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The kitchen light flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure in the corner of the room. A shadow, dark and elongated, lingering near the doorway. I blinked, and it was gone. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my chest. My fingers trembled as I reached for the fridge handle, pulling it open in an attempt to distract myself. The light inside the fridge illuminated the cold, sterile shelves. But the moment the door creaked open, I felt it, a sudden shift in the air, like a pressure building. The cold enveloped me, rushing through my skin, settling deep inside my chest, making it hard to breathe. The temperature had dropped so drastically that it felt as though I were standing outside in the middle of winter, exposed to the elements. I slammed the fridge door shut, but the chill didn't go away. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short gasps, my body trembling uncontrollably. And then I heard it. The whisper. A voice. Soft at first, distant, but unmistakable. Leave, now. I whirled around, eyes wide, but there was nothing. The room was empty. No one was there. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. The voice was gone, but the icy cold that clung to the space was worse than ever. It wasn't just a physical chill, it was a feeling, a presence that seemed to seep into the very walls, the floors, and the air. I stumbled backward, my feet caught on something. I looked down and saw the floorboards, slick with frost, as though the cold had somehow spread across the room, making it feel like I was standing in the frozen depths of the airport once again. I backed away, my mind racing, heart pounding. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a draft. The cold was following me. The spirits were following me. I spun toward the door, desperate to escape, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. In the mirror by the entrance, I saw something, a shadow, flickering behind me. A figure. A pilot. The face was pale, like death itself, and his eyes, dark, hollow, searching, were locked on me. I could feel his gaze burning into my back. I jerked around, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. Was I losing my mind? I rushed to the door, threw it open, and stepped into the night air, trying to breathe. But the cold didn't stop. It followed me like a presence, like something dark and unyielding, always there, just out of sight. As I stood outside in the dark, shivering uncontrollably, I realized the truth. I had never left. The airport, the spirits, the cold, and it all followed me home. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, no matter how far I traveled, the curse would never release me. It would never let me go. The cold would always be with me. That night, sleep came to me reluctantly, like a wave crashing against a jagged shore. I could feel the weight of the day, the exhaustion pressing on my body, but my mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, the airport, loomed large in my mind. The terminal, the runway, the shadows that followed me. But worse than the memories was the feeling that something else was with me, something ancient and cold. As soon as I drifted off, I was pulled into the dreams. I was back at the airport. The terminal stretched out before me, empty and desolate. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was suffocating. I walked through the halls, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vast emptiness. There were no signs of life, no movement, Yet I could feel something was watching me, something waiting. Then, the door at the far end of the hallway creaked open. The sound was so sharp, so unexpected, that I jumped. But when I turned to look, it was only a shadow that filled the doorway, tall and thin, like a man. A pilot. His uniform was old, faded, but I could make out the glint of the insignia on his chest. His face was obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the feeling that radiated from him. Cold. Dead. His eyes were dark, hollow, and I could feel them drilling into me, like he was staring straight through me, seeing something I couldn't even comprehend. Without a word, he stepped into the hallway, and though I should have been terrified, my feet moved toward him, drawn to him. I tried to stop myself, to turn away, but I couldn't. My body moved of its own accord, as if I were a puppet, my limbs stiff and unwilling, yet compelled. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it cut through the thick air. "You shouldn't be here." I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. My heart raced in my chest, and every part of me screamed to run, to get away, but I was paralyzed. The pilot's eyes never left mine. He reached out, a skeletal hand extending toward me, his fingers curling like a claw. I tried to step back, but the ground beneath my feet felt as if it were melting away. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to the cold floor, unable to move, unable to break free from the weight of his presence. Then, the world around me changed. The turmoil vanished, and I found myself standing on a darkened runway, the sky above streaked with clouds. There was an ominous hum in the air, the distant sound of engines revving, but when I looked up, I saw nothing. The pilot appeared beside me, his form materializing from the shadows. He stood silently, staring at the horizon, his hands at his sides, waiting. And then it happened. The plane, or rather, what was left of it, appeared. It wasn't a real plane, not fully. It was more of a twisted version of one, its shape distorted, flickering in and out like a broken image. The wings were torn, the fuselage cracked open, and the lights along the wings blinked erratically, casting brief flashes of light across the darkness. The pilot turned toward it, his eyes hollow, resigned. "It never ends." His voice was distant, as though he were speaking from another time, another world. But his words sank into me like a poison, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Before I could say anything, the plane began to move, gliding down the runway with an unnatural speed, its engines roaring like a beast about to tear through the night. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The pilot's gaze shifted to me, and this time, his expression was not one of warning but of invitation. He motioned toward the plane, his hand stretching out like it had earlier, but now it seemed more insistent. "Come with me," he whispered. "Come with us." I stumbled back, my feet heavy as though I were wading through thick mud. The runway seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how much I tried to move, it felt like I was stuck in place, unable to escape the pull of the ghostly pilot. "You are one of us now," the pilot said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the phantom engines. I looked around, desperately searching for an escape. There was none. The ground beneath my feet seemed to crack and shift, and the shadows of the past, the plane, the pilots, the crash, swallowed the world whole. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me, and I felt myself falling. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air. The room was dark, and the oppressive silence weighed heavily on my chest. My body was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. I looked around the room, the faint light of the street lamp outside casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The air was still, but it felt wrong, like something was pressing down on me, suffocating me. Was it real? The question echoed in my mind, but there was no answer. Only the cold feeling, the lingering sensation of being watched, of being followed. The nightmares had started. And I knew, deep down, that they wouldn't stop. The spirits, the pilots, the haunting airport, they were always with me now. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape him. I could hear his voice in the back of my mind, faint but persistent, as if the pilot was still standing beside me, watching me as I lay in bed, too terrified to sleep again. You are one of us now. And I couldn't help but wonder, was it a warning or a curse? It had been weeks since that cursed night at the airport, and yet the shadows never left me. Every time I tried to push the memories away, they crept back into my mind like an invasive disease. The cold, the whispers, the unyielding presence of those lost pilots, they lingered. I couldn't escape them. No matter how far I went, no matter how many times I tried to lock away the past, it found its way back into my life. Tonight, it was worse. I had moved to a new apartment, hoping the change of scenery would be enough to leave everything behind. The new place was small but comforting, tucked away in a quiet part of the city. For the first few days, I felt a sense of peace, an illusion that the nightmare was finally over. But tonight, the feeling came again, the suffocating weight of the unknown. It was the quiet that first unsettled me. The air around me felt thick, as if the world outside had stopped breathing. I tried to ignore it, but the silence pressed down on me, heavier than before. Then, as I sat on the couch, staring at the flickering television, a cold draft swept through the room. It wasn't like any breeze I had ever felt. It was icy, unnatural. The temperature plummeted so quickly that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I stood up, my heart racing in my chest. The chill ran deeper than the air. It sank into my bones, into my very soul. It was a sensation I knew all too well. The same cold I had felt at the airport, the same chill that had followed me from that cursed place. Then I heard it. A faint sound, soft, distant, almost imperceptible, came from the direction of the window. It was a tapping, a slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. I froze. No one was out there. No one should be out there. I had checked the locks on all the windows earlier, and the street below was empty. The tapping continued, deliberate and insistent. It wasn't the wind. I slowly approached the window, my hands trembling. The tapping grew louder as I got closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was so silent now, so still, except for the tapping. I reached for the curtain and pulled it back, the movement feeling like the slowest action of my life, as if the world itself were holding its breath. At first, I saw nothing. The street below was empty, and the night was still. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shadow. It was standing just outside the window, tall and thin, like a figure I knew all too well. The dark silhouette of a pilot, his face obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the uniform. The faded insignia. The hollow, empty eyes that I could feel even through the glass. My breath caught in my throat. My legs trembled, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The figure raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and pressed it against the glass. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the soft sound of breath fogging up the window from the other side. It was as if he was trying to reach me, trying to make contact, trying to pull me back into his world. I took a step back, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Not again. But the figure didn't move. It stayed there, pressing its hand against the glass, the eyes fixed on mine. I could feel its cold presence, the same suffocating chill that had surrounded me at the airport. He was waiting for me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the weight of those words. He had been waiting for me all this time, lurking in the shadows, following me, making sure I could never truly escape. I backed away slowly, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. The air around me grew colder still, the temperature dropping to a point where I could see my breath clouding in front of me. I knew, deep down, that he wasn't just outside the window. He was already inside my mind, already inside my soul. A soft voice echoed through the silence. "You belong to us now." I turned and ran. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just ran, through the apartment, down the hallway, out into the street. But when I reached the sidewalk, the cold still clung to me. It was in my skin, in my breath, in my bones. The shadows from the airport were never far behind. I stopped and looked around. The street was empty. No one was there. But then, I felt it again. That chill. The same bone-deep cold. And as I turned, I saw him. Standing across the street, just beyond the street lamp, the pilot. He was watching me. I turned and ran again, not caring where, just needing to get away. But no matter where I went, I could feel him with me. I could hear his voice, soft and distant, always just out of reach. "You belong to us now." And I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, I would never be free. The spirits of the airport had claimed me, and they would never let me go. It had been months since that night, the night I had finally come to terms with the fact that the spirits of the airport would never let me go. No matter how many new cities I moved to, no matter how many places I tried to bury myself in, the cold, the whispers, the shadows, they were always there, lurking just beyond the edge of my reality. I had learned to live with the lingering terror, the eerie sense of being watched, the constant chill that followed me wherever I went. But just when I thought I had managed to keep my sanity intact, I received an unexpected message, one I thought would never find its way to me. It was an email. At first glance, it seemed like any other spam, something about a unique opportunity for thrill seekers, an exclusive experience for those looking to explore forgotten places. But something about the subject line caught my attention, explore the mystery of Phantom Airport. My blood ran cold. I stared at the message, unable to tear my eyes away from the words. It was like a cruel joke, an invitation, a repeat of everything I had lived through. The memory of the airport, the spirits, the twisted feeling of being trapped in a never-ending loop came flooding back with terrifying clarity. My hand trembled as I clicked on the email. The message was simple. "We've heard about your experience at Phantom Airport in Arizona. We know what you've seen, and we believe you deserve to witness it again. Join us, if you dare." The chilling invitation echoed in my mind. Join us, if you dare. I could feel my heart pounding, my throat tightening. The words were like a summons, a siren's call to something dark and inescapable. How had they found me? How had they known about what happened at the airport? The haunting thought gripped me. Was it happening again? I immediately hit delete, but the screen flickered, the email reappearing as if it had never been erased. A chill ran down my spine. I stared at it, unable to look away. A new message appeared at the top of the email thread. "We're waiting for you." I slammed my laptop shut, but the message still lingered in my mind. It was a warning, a cruel, endless cycle that I couldn't break free from. I tried to distract myself, to ignore the nagging sensation that something was watching, waiting. But the message refused to leave me. The feeling of being hunted, of being drawn into a trap, gnawed at me until I couldn't stand it anymore. I knew the cycle had begun again. That night, I was restless. The shadows in my room seemed deeper, the air heavier. The familiar cold settled around me like a blanket of ice. And once again, I heard the tapping, slow and deliberate, coming from the window. I froze, my body tense, a lump forming in my throat. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see it again. But I couldn't stop myself. I moved toward the window, my every step slow, each one heavier than the last. The tapping had stopped, but the chill remained. I parted the curtains just enough to peek outside. And there it was. A figure stood outside, tall and still, wearing the same dark, faded uniform. The same hollow eyes. The same spectral presence that haunted my every waking moment. The pilot. He stood motionless, as though waiting for something or someone. His gaze met mine through the glass, his expression unreadable, yet full of that same eerie sense of inevitability. The tapping had stopped, but I could feel it in the air, the same call that had once pulled me toward the airport, toward the runway, toward my own terrifying fate. And then, just as before, I heard the soft whisper in my mind. "You belong to us now." A shiver ran through me, but this time I didn't have the strength to fight it. The darkness had a hold on me, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I would never escape. I had joined them, just as the pilot had promised. And now, it was my turn to become part of the endless cycle. As I stood there, staring out the window, I felt a presence behind me. Something, or someone, was waiting inside my own apartment. I didn't need to turn around to know that I wasn't alone. A new visitor, someone eager, someone unaware, would soon receive the same invitation. The cycle would continue, and they would never be able to escape. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.